Hello there, and welcome to Biology with Charles, where curiosity gets cozy and science takes the scenic route to sleep. Tonight, we're settling in with a question that sounds almost too lovely to be true, and yet your brain seems to do it all the time. Can the mind keep working on a problem after you've stopped trying, turned off the light, pulled the blanket up and drifted away? It does seem a little unfair, doesn't it, that some of your best thinking may happen while the rest of you is lying there like a bundled potato doing absolutely nothing useful in particular. And yet, again and again, people wake with a clearer thought, a better idea, a missing answer, or at least the comforting sense that the mental knot they went to bed with is not quite tied as tightly by morning. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight, and what kind of hour it is in your corner of the world. If this gentle exploration brings you some calm, or keeps you company as the day softens around you, I'd be very grateful if you liked the video, and maybe subscribed as well. It helps this quiet little space reach more people who might like a bit of peaceful science before sleep. Now, get comfortable, let your breathing slow a touch, and let's begin with the strange and reassuring fact that even when you seem to be doing nothing at all, your brain is still very much on the job. Most of us grow up with a simple picture of sleep. Daytime is for effort. Nighttime is for shutting down. You think, work, decide, worry, plan, and solve while awake, and then at night the whole system powers off like a shop closing at the end of the day. Lights out, chairs up, front door locked, no one inside until morning. It is a very tidy idea. It is also deeply wrong. Sleep is not the brain closing. Sleep is the brain changing tasks. Some activities fade, others become more prominent. Some networks that dominate waking life loosen their grip, and different patterns of activity take over. What looks from the outside like stillness is, from the inside, a shift in priorities. That matters because problem solving is not one single thing. We often imagine solving a problem as a conscious act. You sit there, focus hard, consider the facts, reject bad options, compare possibilities, and arrive at an answer. Sometimes that is exactly what happens if you're doing a tax form, assembling furniture, or trying to remember whether you already added salt to a soup. Deliberate conscious thought is very helpful. But many problems are not solved by direct force. Many problems get stuck precisely because conscious effort has hit the same wall too many times. You circle the issue, you repeat the same angle, you keep asking the same tired little committee in your head to produce a breakthrough, and the committee, being overworked and underinspired, keeps handing back the same old paperwork. Sleep can help because the sleeping brain does not approach information in quite the same way as the waking brain. During the day, attention is narrow. It has to be. If it were not, you would never finish anything. You would begin making tea, notice a spoon, remember a documentary about silver mining, think about historical trade networks, wonder whether your socks are in the dryer, and end the afternoon without tea, socks, or dignity. Waking attention keeps life manageable by filtering aggressively. It selects, it suppresses, it chooses what matters right now and pushes the rest aside. That is useful, but it can also make thinking rigid. You can become trapped inside the first interpretation that seems sensible. Sleep, on the other hand, seems to relax some of that rigidity. It does not simply erase the day, it reprocesses it. Experiences are replayed, sorted, strengthened, weakened, linked, and sometimes reorganized in ways that are difficult to achieve when you are consciously clinging to one specific route toward an answer. The result is that a problem that looked immovable at 11:30 p.m. may look oddly manageable at 7 a.m. Nothing magical has happened. No tiny committee in waistcoats has marched through your skull with clipboards and lanterns. What has happened is that the brain continued to work on the materials of the problem, while no longer being trapped inside your most obvious waking habits. This idea has fascinated people for a very long time. Artists, mathematicians, scientists, composers, inventors, writers, and ordinary exhausted humans have all told versions of the same story. They struggled with something, they stopped, they slept. The next morning brought clarity. Sometimes it was a full answer, More often it was a next step, a fresh angle, a sense of which part mattered most, or a new way of framing the question. That distinction is important. Sleep does not turn the brain into a vending machine where you insert a problem at bedtime and collect a polished solution with your morning tea. It is less tidy than that. The sleeping brain is not obedient. It does not work to deadline. It is not especially impressed by your plans. What it does do is continue processing information in ways that often support insight, memory organization, pattern detection, and cognitive flexibility. To understand why, it helps to think about what a problem actually is. A problem is rarely just a lack of information. Sometimes it is, of course. If you do not know the capital of a country, you're not one nap away from inventing it correctly. But many of the problems that benefit from sleep are not empty gaps. They are overloaded spaces. You know too much, and it is all jumbled together. You have facts, half-facts, impressions, fears, assumptions, wrong turns, emotional reactions, old memories, useful details, and irrelevant details all packed into one mental drawer. Daytime thought often tries to solve the problem by grabbing the same items from the front of that drawer over and over. Sleep appears to help by rearranging the drawer itself. Imagine spending all evening trying to find an important receipt in a crowded kitchen drawer. You keep lifting the same rubber bands, old batteries, folded menus, mystery keys, and take-out sauce packets. Each time you search in slightly different order, but the drawer remains a mess. Then overnight, not by magic but by a quiet act of sorting, someone has grouped the contents. The keys are together, the paper is together, the tools are together. The junk is still junk, but at least it is now organized junk. In the morning, the receipt is not newly created. It is newly visible. That is closer to what sleep may do for thought. It improves the arrangement of what is already there. Part of this depends on memory. Much of learning and problem solving relies not just on receiving information, but on stabilizing it and fitting it into existing knowledge. During waking life, the brain is bombarded. Sounds, faces, words, deadlines, notifications, worries, half-finished tasks, mild embarrassments from 3 years ago that arrive uninvited while brushing your teeth, all of it competes for space. The brain cannot keep every detail equally. So later, especially during sleep, it seems to go back over recent experience and decide what to preserve, what to integrate, and what to let fade. That process is not only about remembering facts, it also helps build relationships between pieces of information. Once those relationships change, the shape of a problem changes too. This is one reason the old advice to sleep on it has survived for so long. It sounds folksy, but it contains real wisdom. To sleep on a problem is to allow time for a mode of brain activity that differs from conscious struggle. Very often, when people are stuck, more effort is not the answer. Better arrangement is. More pressure is not the answer. Better integration is. You do not always need more hours of staring. You may need several hours of not staring, while the brain quietly keeps sorting in the background. There is also the matter of emotion. Problems are almost never purely logical while we are living inside them. Even small issues become emotionally flavoured. You're not just solving a presentation, you're solving the fear of getting it wrong. You're not just deciding what to say to someone, you're solving the memory of past awkwardness, the hope of being understood, the dread of conflict, the wish to be liked. All of that emotional material can narrow thinking. It can make one possibility feel too risky, one interpretation feel too personal, one failure feel too important. Sleep can help loosen some of that emotional grip, not always completely, and certainly not with perfect mercy, but often enough to matter. Anyone who has panicked at night and then felt almost embarrassed by the same worry in daylight knows this shift. The night brain can be dramatic. A mildly awkward email becomes a career-ending disaster. A forgotten errand becomes proof that you are incapable of adult life. A strange ache becomes a medical mystery, ideally discovered at 1:14 a.m. using the least reassuring corners of the internet. By morning, the same issue often returns to human scale. That does not mean the nighttime feeling was silly. It means the brain in one state evaluates information differently from the brain in another. Sleep, by moving the brain through distinct stages and resetting aspects of attention, emotion, and physiology, helps restore proportion. Proportion is essential for problem solving, because many stuck problems remain stuck not for lack of intelligence, but because the mind has lost scale. Consider the difference between effort and incubation. Effort is direct. Incubation is indirect. During effort, you consciously work the problem. During incubation, you step away, and some form of processing continues without deliberate control. Sleep is perhaps the most complete incubation period we experience regularly. That makes it especially interesting. When you take a walk, shower, wash dishes, or stare out a window pretending to think noble thoughts, while actually replaying an awkward conversation from 2017, your brain is still awake and partly occupied. Sleep changes the entire operating mode. It is not just a break from the problem, it is a different kind of contact with it. Researchers who study learning, memory, and insight have repeatedly found that sleep can improve performance on tasks that require recognizing hidden patterns, extracting rules, or reaching solutions that were not obvious before rest. Not every study says the same thing in the same way, and not every nap turns anyone into a genius by breakfast. Science, disappointingly but wisely, refuses to promise miracles. Still, the general pattern is clear enough to be compelling. Sleep often supports the kind of reorganization that makes insight more likely. It can strengthen useful memories, strip away irrelevant noise, and help the brain detect structure it did not fully grasp during initial learning. A great deal of this depends on the idea that the brain is not simply recording experience like a camera. It is interpreting all the time. Even while awake, it is building models, finding regularities, predicting what comes next, and linking new material to old material. During sleep, some of these processes appear to continue in altered form. Neural patterns associated with waking experience may be replayed. Brain regions involved in memory and association may interact in ways that support consolidation and abstraction. That is a formal way of saying the brain may use sleep not only to keep the details of an experience, but to pull out what matters from them. That pulling out is central to solving problems. Often the answer is blocked because we are too close to the surface details. We keep dealing with the exact wording, the exact image, the exact arrangement that frustrated us in the first place. What sleep may offer is a chance for the mind to become less attached to the original presentation and more sensitive to the deeper structure. It is the difference between seeing 5 separate puzzle pieces and noticing that they all belong to the same corner. Once the structure becomes visible, the next move becomes easier. It is also worth saying that sleep's helpfulness is not a sign that conscious thinking is weak. Quite the opposite. Conscious thought gathers the materials, it defines the problem, it identifies the goals, it does the hard first work. Sleep is not replacing waking intelligence, it is partnering with it. You spend the day feeding the system spends the night doing something with what it has been given. This partnership is one of the most ordinary marvels of being human. You do not need to become a monk, a mystic, or a person who owns 7 different herbal teas in glass jars with suspiciously confident labels. You simply need a brain, a problem, and actual sleep. Actual sleep is the important part there. Modern life is full of people who admire sleep in theory and betray it in practice. We talk fondly about rest while scrolling ourselves into confusion under a bright rectangle at midnight. We treat sleep as negotiable, as though the brain were a sturdy office printer that can handle one more late-night job if you kick it a bit and ignore the burning smell. Then we wonder why thinking becomes less flexible, memory less reliable, mood less stable, and insight less frequent. It is one of the great ironies of modern intelligence that many people try to think their way out of problems using the very habits that make thinking worse. When sleep is shortened, fragmented, or poor in quality, several things begin to suffer. Attention weakens, working memory becomes more fragile, emotional balance becomes harder to maintain, the ability to shift perspective decreases. All of that makes problem solving more difficult. It is not merely that you feel tired, it is that the brain's capacity to hold information, compare options, suppress distractions and update interpretations is reduced. The result is often a kind of mental stubbornness. You keep trying the same route because flexible thinking is expensive, and a tired brain becomes conservative. It chooses the familiar path, even when the familiar path is clearly driving into a hedge. Well-rested thinking is different. It is not necessarily faster in every case, but it is often more adaptive. That adaptability is what people mean, in part, when they say a problem looks different after sleep. The facts may be unchanged, the situation may be unchanged, but the brain handling those facts is no longer the same as the one that went to bed. It has passed through cycles of activity that help regulate emotion, organize memory, and alter the balance between focused control and broader association. In that sense, you're not waking up to the same mind you had before sleep. You're waking up to a mind that has been at work. There is something deeply comforting in that. Much of waking life is filled with the pressure to perform solutions on command. Answer now, decide now, respond now, fix now, know now. And if you do not know now, pretend you do, preferably while maintaining cheerful eye contact. Sleep introduces a different logic. Some forms of knowing cannot be rushed. Some answers require a period in which direct effort quiets down. That is not laziness. It is part of cognition. The mind is not a single bright spotlight that either shines or switches off. It is a changing system with multiple ways of handling information across time. Even dreams, strange as they are, hint at this. Dreams do not usually hand over neat instruction manuals. They are messy, theatrical, illogical, and occasionally rude. They mix memory fragments with emotion, recent events with old associations, practical concerns with absurd details that would embarrass a turnip. Yet beneath the nonsense there may be useful processing. The dreaming mind is not bound by the same strict rules as waking thought. It jumps, combines, exaggerates and reimagines. That looseness can sometimes reveal connections that focused thinking missed. Not because dreams are magical messages, but because flexible association can be cognitively useful, even when it arrives wearing the world's least professional costume. This opening part of the story, then, begins with a simple correction to the common myth. Sleep is not absence. Sleep is activity of another kind. Your brain does not stop when you do. It enters phases in which it can sort, replay, strengthen, weaken, connect, separate, regulate, and reorganize. That overnight work does not guarantee insight, but it often prepares the ground for it. The problem you carry into bed may not be solved by dawn, but it may be softened, clarified, reduced to its true size, or quietly rearranged so that the answer sits closer to the surface. And perhaps that is why there is such relief in giving up just for the night on forcing a solution. You are not abandoning the problem. You are handing it to another mode of mind. The daytime self, with all its effort and impatience, steps back. The sleeping brain takes over, not as a magician, but as a patient organizer. It keeps moving through the material while you drift through darkness, while your breathing settles, while the body lies still and the mind begins its night work. And the first step in understanding how your brain solves problems while you sleep is to see that sleep itself is not empty time at all, but the beginning of a different kind of thinking, one that starts as waking fades and the brain crosses that quiet threshold into the night. There is a curious little moment each night that most of us barely notice, even though it happens again and again across the whole of our lives. One moment you're awake, following a thought, adjusting a pillow, wondering whether you replied to that message, deciding that tomorrow you will absolutely become a more organized person, and then, without any clean dramatic border, the waking world begins to loosen. The room is still there, the bed is still there, your body is still there. But the tight grip of alertness starts to soften. The mind that, only minutes earlier, was trying to manage time, tasks, memory, and mild nonsense, with great seriousness begins to let go of its post. It is tempting to think of this as a shutdown, like switching off a lamp. But that is not what falling asleep is. It is not a simple off switch. It is a transfer of control, a change in state, a careful descent through a set of biological events that are much more active and organized than they appear from the outside. From the outside, sleep on set looks wonderfully unremarkable. A person gets quiet. Their face relaxes. Their movements grow smaller. The eyes remain closed. Breathing becomes slower and steadier. If they are especially graceful, they drift into sleep like a calm leaf landing on still water. If they are like the rest of us, they twitch once, make a strange half snore, briefly panic that they were not asleep at all, and then continue onward. Inside the brain, though, a great deal is happening. Falling asleep is not the moment the brain stops working. It is the moment the brain begins reorganizing itself for a different kind of work. To understand that shift, it helps to remember what being awake requires. Waking consciousness is expensive. It demands constant coordination between attention, memory, sensation, movement, emotion, and prediction. Even when you are sitting still doing very little, the waking brain is still processing the world around you, tracking your body, filtering noise, interpreting language, updating internal models, and deciding what deserves notice. This takes energy and delicate regulation. Throughout the day, the balance that keeps you awake is maintained by networks in the brain that promote arousal and alertness. These systems use chemical messengers that encourage wakefulness, attention, and responsiveness. So, when sleep begins, it is not merely that tiredness increases. It is also that wake-promoting systems lose ground while sleep-promoting systems become stronger. One of the most important ingredients in this nightly shift is a slow build-up of what scientists call sleep pressure. The longer you stay awake, the more the brain accumulates signals that push it towards sleep. One of the key players in this process is adenosine, a molecule that increases during waking life as the brain uses energy. You can think of it, loosely, as part of the chemical record of being awake for a long time. As adenosine builds up, the drive to sleep becomes stronger. This is one reason why wakefulness becomes harder to sustain late at night, and why sleep often feels deeply satisfying after a long day. The system has been leaning in that direction for hours. Caffeine, rather famously, interferes with this process. It does not remove sleep pressure. It simply blocks some of the adenine's ability to signal that pressure, which is why coffee can create the charming illusion that the laws of biology are flexible and you are somehow above them. The laws of biology, however, are patient. They wait. Then they collect their payment at inconvenient hours. So, when the lights go out and sleep begins, part of what is happening is that the brain is finally responding to a need that has been building quietly since morning. But sleep pressure alone is not the whole story. There is also the circadian system, the internal clock that helps determine when you feel more alert and when you feel more ready for sleep. This system is influenced strongly by light, especially daylight, and it helps synchronize the body's rhythms across roughly 24 hours. In the evening, as light decreases, the body begins shifting toward a night mode. Melatonin levels rise, body temperature starts to change, alertness often drops. None of this forces sleep by itself, but it helps set the stage. Sleep pressure says you have been awake long enough. Circadian timing says this is the appropriate part of the day to sleep. When the two align, falling asleep becomes easier. When they do not, the whole thing becomes more awkward. That is why trying to sleep at the wrong biological time can feel like negotiating with a stubborn committee inside your skull. So, as you lie there at night, two broad forces are working together. One comes from time spent awake, the other comes from time of day, If the conditions are right, they nudge the brain toward a transition. This transition does not happen all at once. There is a threshold, but it is fuzzy. Many people think of sleep onset as a clean snap between awake and asleep. In reality, it is often a gradual crossing. The brain begins to disengage from the outside world in stages. Attention drifts. Thoughts become less organized. Sensory awareness changes. The boundary between deliberate thinking and automatic imagery starts to blur. This is why the first few minutes of falling asleep can be such a strange place. You may still feel as though you are thinking normally, but the content of thought begins to shift in peculiar ways. Ideas become looser. Logic weakens. Images intrude. A sentence begins sensibly and ends somewhere near a bus stop with a goat wearing spectacles. You may notice a drifting kind of mental nonsense that would be impossible to take seriously in full daylight. This is not failure of thought. It is a sign that the waking style of cognition is giving way to something else. That in-between period, often called sleep onset, has fascinated researchers because it contains features of both waking and sleeping consciousness. The brain is not fully one thing or the other. During this time, people may experience brief sensory distortions, sudden muscle jerks, fragments of dreamlike imagery, or the odd conviction that they are still perfectly awake even while measurable signs of sleep have already begun. Sleep, it turns out, can sneak up on the mind with a certain quiet confidence. One of the better-known oddities of this stage is the hypnic jerk, sometimes called a sleep start. This is the sudden twitch or jolt that can happen just as you're drifting off. Perhaps you feel as if you were falling. Perhaps one arm leaps dramatically as though it has urgent news. Perhaps the whole body gives a brief rebellious kick. These jerks are common and usually harmless, though they can be a bit insulting when you had only just begun to sink into comfort. Scientists do not agree completely on why they happen, but they seem to reflect the nervous system shifting states while muscle control and sensory interpretation are changing. It is as if the body, midway through surrendering to sleep, suddenly checks whether it is absolutely sure about this entire arrangement. At the same time, the brain's electrical activity is changing. In wakefulness, especially when you are alert and engaged, the brain shows faster, more desynchronized patterns of activity. As you relax and close your eyes, alpha waves often become more prominent. These are associated with relaxed wakefulness, especially when visual attention decreases. Then, as sleep deepens into the first stage of non-REM sleep, brain activity begins shifting further. Theta waves become more common. This stage, known as N1, is light sleep. It is the threshold state, the first official step away from waking consciousness. N1 is a peculiar place. People awakened from it often insist they were not asleep at all. And in a sense, that makes emotional sense, because sleep at this stage feels fragile and incomplete. You may still hear sounds in the room. You may still have some awareness of your position in bed. Thoughts may continue, but they become less anchored and more dreamlike. Memory for this period is often patchy. It is easy to underestimate how much time has passed or to misjudge whether sleep happened at all. This is one reason insomnia can feel so vicious. A person may spend more time sleeping lightly than they realize, but because it does not feel like real sleep, the whole night can seem blank and punishing. As N1 gives way to N2, the brain moves further into stable non-REM sleep. Sensory disconnection increases. Awareness of the outside world drops more reliably. Brain activity shows distinctive features called sleep spindles and K-complexes. Sleep spindles are brief bursts of rhythmic activity that seem to play roles in memory processing and in helping shield sleep from disruption. K-complexes are larger waveforms that may help the brain evaluate stimuli while preserving sleep. In a rough way, they seem to reflect the brain saying, "Yes, I noticed that sound, but unless it matters very much, I will be remaining asleep, thank you." This is part of what makes falling asleep such an elegant biological act. It is not simply disappearance into darkness. It is a managed withdrawal from the external world. The brain does not abandon surveillance entirely. It reduces it, filters it, reprioritizes it. Important signals may still break through. A parent may wake to a child's cry while sleeping through distant traffic. A person may sleep through rain but wake to their own name. Sleep is not total abandonment of the environment. It is selective disengagement, carefully negotiated. Meanwhile, the body is changing too. Muscles relax further, heart rate tends to slow, breathing becomes more regular, core body temperature declines, metabolism shifts. Hormonal patterns begin changing in ways that support overnight restoration and regulation. Even posture matters. The body settles into stillness not because nothing is happening, but because so much is being redirected inward. Waking life is outward-facing. Sleep is largely inward-facing. Energy that would have supported active movement and constant sensory tracking is now freed for different kinds of maintenance and processing. This is the point at which many people imagine the brain has gone quiet. But in reality, the early stages of sleep are part of a structured progression. Non-REM sleep deepens across the first part of the night, eventually reaching slow-wave sleep, the deepest non-REM stage, where large, slow oscillations dominate brain activity. This stage is especially associated with physical restoration and certain forms of memory consolidation. Later in the night, REM sleep becomes more prominent, with its vivid dreaming and distinct brain activity patterns. But before any of that unfolds fully, the initial descent matters. The way the brain falls asleep is not random. It is the opening movement in a sequence that shapes the entire night. And this opening movement begins with a reduction in the brain's commitment to wakeful control. During the day, much of mental life depends on networks involved in focused attention, executive function, and deliberate control. These systems help you maintain goals, suppress distractions, hold information in mind, and behave like a coherent person in public, or at least resemble one. As sleep begins, those systems loosen. This helps explain why thoughts grow stranger and less logical during sleep onset. The mind is no longer policing its own content as tightly. Associations become freer. Fragments of memory may surface without context. The line between thought and image begins to thin. That freer associative quality may be one reason the edge of sleep sometimes feels creatively fertile. Writers, artists, and inventors have long been interested in the half-drowsy state, where the mind is slipping but not yet gone. In that zone, ideas can arrive that are less constrained by linear logic. Most of them are useless, of course. The sleeping mind is generous but not particularly editorial. For every genuinely interesting connection, there are several that sound profound at midnight and ridiculous by breakfast. Still, the looseness of early sleep reveals something important. The brain is already moving away from the strict structure of waking cognition, and that altered structure may later support the reorganization of information that helps with problem solving. There is also the matter of sensory boundaries. When you're awake, the brain is continuously integrating information from the outside world with information from the body and from memory. During sleep onset, this integration shifts. External input becomes less dominant. Internal material becomes more vivid. That is why the mind can start producing images, voices, sensations, or brief dream fragments, even while the body is still only lightly asleep. The world outside is fading in authority. The world generated within is becoming more prominent. This shift is not always comfortable. For some people, the edge of sleep can be anxious. Thoughts become slippery. Control fades. The usual stable sense of self feels less firm. This can be unsettling, especially for those who fear the loss of control that sleep requires. To fall asleep, after all, is to stop managing consciousness directly. It is to trust a biological process to take over. That trust comes easily to some and poorly to others. The mind that wants to keep checking, solving, reviewing, and controlling may resist the transition. And yet the transition cannot be bullied. Sleep is not impressed by being ordered around. That is one of the quiet lessons of falling asleep. The process works best when it is allowed rather than forced. You can prepare for it. You can support it. You can make it easier by aligning light exposure, routine, temperature and timing, but you cannot command it in the same way you command your hand to pick up a glass. Sleep begins when the conditions are right enough and the brain shifts states. This is why trying very hard to sleep is often such a poor strategy. The effort itself keeps wake-promoting systems active. It is like trying to drift on water by thrashing. And yet, every healthy night, most of us eventually make the transition. The waking brain, for all its noise and urgency, gives way. Attention narrows, then softens, then breaks apart. Thoughts lose their formal trousers and begin wandering the corridors in a dressing gown. The body grows heavier. The external world dims. The electrical patterns of the brain change. Memory of the moment becomes less reliable. Consciousness, instead of disappearing cleanly, changes texture and depth. Then the first true steps into sleep are underway. This transition matters for the larger story of how the brain solves problems at night, because sleep onset is the point where the rules of cognition begin to change. While fully awake, you are often stuck inside the same conscious framing of a problem. You return to the same phrasing, the same emotional charge, the same failed route. But as the brain moves into sleep, that controlled frame begins to weaken. By itself, the moment of falling asleep does not usually solve anything. It is not a magical answer chamber, but it marks the start of a night in which information will be handled differently. Memories will be replayed. Associations will shift. Emotional intensity may be recalibrated. Noise may be stripped away from signal. None of that can happen unless the crossing occurs. It is also worth appreciating how ordinary and astonishing this is. Every night, millions of brains perform this transition with no conscious supervision. No tiny operator in a booth inside the skull pulls levers and announces, "Stage 1 commencing, please keep all arms inside the cortex." The process emerges from deeply evolved systems interacting with chemical signals, circadian timing, neural networks, bodily states, and environmental cues. It is automatic but not simple, familiar but extraordinary. We trust it because it happens so often, yet it remains one of the most complex routine acts in biology. And perhaps that is part of why sleep can feel so mysterious. We experience only fragments of the crossing. We know what it is like to lie awake. We know what it is like to wake up. But the moment between the two is often lost or distorted. It resists ownership. You cannot quite watch yourself fall asleep in real time without staying awake enough to interrupt it. It is one of those processes that works best when not observed too closely, like trying to look directly at your own calmness and thereby ruining it. Still, the science of sleep lets us peek behind the curtain a little. When the lights go out and you begin to drift, your brain is not fading into emptiness. It is entering a carefully structured sequence of state changes. Wake-promoting systems quiet down. Sleep pressure is finally answered. Circadian timing supports the turn inward. Sensory processing shifts. Brain rhythms change. Muscles relax. Awareness loosens. The first layer of sleep forms, light but real, and beneath it lies the rest of the night with all its deeper stages and stranger workings. So the next time you feel that soft slipping feeling, that odd unfastening of thought as night begins to take hold, it may help to remember that this is not a failure of attention or a blank collapse into nothing. It is the opening act of sleep, and it is full of biological purpose. The waking mind steps back. Another kind of processing prepares to begin. The problem you carried to bed may still be there, but the brain that will hold it through the night is no longer using the same tools, and that quiet difference, beginning in the first moments after wakefulness lets go, is where the night's work truly starts. It is easy to believe in the illusion of stillness. A sleeping person lies there in near silence, eyes closed, body mostly motionless, not replying to messages, not solving equations out loud, not making any visible attempt to improve the state of their life. From the outside, sleep looks like absence. It looks like the day has been switched off, and the person has gone temporarily unavailable, like a shop with the lights down and the sign turned to closed. Because of that, many people carry around a very old and very stubborn idea that sleep is basically a blank stretch of inactivity, a pause in the real business of being a mind. Wakefulness is where action happens, sleep is where action stops. But once scientists began studying the sleeping brain more closely, that tidy little story fell apart. Sleep is not mental emptiness. It is not neural silence. It is not the brain shutting the doors and going home. Sleep is an active, structured, dynamic condition in which the brain continues working in ways that are different from waking life but no less real. In some respects, it may be better to think of sleep not as the opposite of wakefulness, but as a different mode of operation. The brain does not merely do less at night, it does different things. Some waking functions are reduced, others are intensified, some networks become quieter, others become more coordinated. Different chemical environments take shape, different electrical rhythms dominate, information is handled differently, memory is processed differently, sensory input is filtered differently, consciousness itself changes form. If you could shrink down and wander through the sleeping brain, you would not find a dark abandoned warehouse. You would find a busy city working the night shift. That night shift matters because a great many essential tasks cannot be done well while the brain is fully occupied with staying awake in the world. Waking life demands constant responsiveness. Even when you think you are resting during the day, the brain is still committed to monitoring the environment, interpreting signals, predicting outcomes, guiding movement, controlling attention, and maintaining the coherent illusion that you are one stable individual moving neatly through time. That is a lot of administrative labour. Sleep offers something different. It creates protected time in which many of those outward-facing responsibilities are reduced, allowing the brain to turn inward and devote more of its resources to restoration, organisation, calibration, and integration. One reason the myth of sleep as emptiness survived for so long is that the sleeping body really does look quiet. But appearances here are misleading. If you record brain activity during sleep, you do not see flatness, you see patterns. These patterns change across the night in recognisable stages, each with its own characteristics and likely functions. Non-REM sleep, especially its deeper forms, is marked by slow, synchronized oscillations. REM sleep, by contrast, shows brain activity that in some ways resembles wakefulness more than deep sleep. During REM, the brain can become highly active. Vivid dreams often occur. The eyes move rapidly beneath the lids, and yet the body remains largely paralyzed to prevent the acting out of dreams. That is not emptiness. That is a complex biological state with very specific properties. Even in non-REM sleep, where consciousness is reduced and the world seems far away, the brain is not idle. It is coordinating large-scale rhythms, processing recent experience, regulating connections between regions, and engaging in forms of neural housekeeping that are difficult to carry out while awake. Certain memories are strengthened, others may be weakened or trimmed. Patterns of waking experience are replayed. Synaptic connections may be recalibrated. The chemistry of the brain shifts to support these activities. If you judge activity only by whether a person is speaking, moving, or replying to emails, you miss the much deeper point. The sleeping brain is not performing outward action because its activity has changed purpose. A useful comparison might be a theatre after the audience leaves. During the performance, the building is full of visible action. Actors are on stage, lights are bright, music plays, staff guide the crowd, and everything is directed toward the outward event. After the show, from the street, the theatre looks quiet, but inside the work is not over. Costumes are sorted, props are reset, the stage is cleaned, repairs are made, accounts are checked, schedules are updated, and plans are laid for tomorrow. The visible event has ended, but essential activity continues. Sleep is like that. Wakefulness is the public performance. Sleep is what keeps the whole system viable. This matters enormously for problem solving, because many cognitive abilities depend not just on what happens in the moment of effort, but on what happens afterward. Learning, flexibility, attention, emotional balance, pattern recognition, and memory all rely on processes that unfold across time. You do not learn simply by exposure. You learn by encoding, consolidating, and integrating. You do not solve a problem simply by staring at it. You solve it partly by arranging the relevant information in ways that allow a solution to emerge. Sleep appears to support precisely these behind-the-scenes operations. That is why a brain that never truly rests can wake better, prepared to think clearly than the same brain was the night before. Memory is one of the clearest examples. During waking life, the brain is constantly taking in information, but the initial recording of experience is fragile. Recent memories are especially vulnerable. They can be distorted by interference, lost through distraction, or stored in ways that remain shallow and incomplete. Sleep helps stabilize some of these traces. The hippocampus, a region deeply involved in the temporary handling of new experiences, seems to interact with the cortex during sleep in ways that support consolidation. Very roughly speaking, it is as though sleep helps move memory from a quick temporary workspace into more distributed long-term storage. This is not a literal transfer like moving files from one folder to another, but the metaphor captures something useful. Sleep helps the brain decide what to keep, how strongly to keep it, and how to connect it to what is already known. That last part, connection, is especially important. A memory that remains isolated is not very useful. What makes knowledge powerful is not just storage but relationship. New information becomes helpful when it is linked to older information, fitted into broader patterns, and made available for future use. Sleep seems to support this integration. It does not only preserve the details of what happened, it may also help extract the structure, the gist, the hidden regularity. That is one reason sleep can improve not just rote recall, but insight. A problem that made no sense before bed may seem clearer in the morning, not because the answer dropped from heaven, but because the brain spent part of the night reorganizing the material from which the answer can be built. There is also evidence that the brain replays waking experiences during sleep. In animals, researchers have observed patterns of neural activity during sleep that resemble activity seen during waking behavior, especially in relation to spatial learning. It is as though the brain revisits aspects of recent experience when the body is no longer engaged in it. Humans, being inconveniently harder to study in this exact way, still appear to show related processes through indirect measures. Replay is thought to help strengthen memory traces and support learning. But it may also do something more interesting. Replaying experience does not necessarily mean reproducing it exactly. The brain may compress it, reweight it, connect it with other material, or abstract its broader features. Once again, this is active work, not passive drift. Then there is the issue of synapses, the connections through which neurons communicate. Waking life is full of learning and responsiveness, both of which can lead to the strengthening of certain connections. If that strengthening simply accumulated without regulation, the brain would face serious problems. It would become energetically costly, noisy, and less selective. One influential idea, known as the synaptic homeostasis hypothesis, suggests that sleep helps downscale synaptic strength globally after a day of wakeful activity, preserving what matters while reducing excess. The exact details are debated, as they often are in science because the brain refuses to be tidy, but the general idea is appealing. Sleep may help reset the neural landscape so that the system remains efficient and ready to learn again. In everyday terms, the brain may use sleep to keep itself from becoming cluttered. Clutter is a useful concept here. Waking cognition generates a great deal of noise. Some of it is necessary, some of it is useless. Some of it is unfinished business, repeated worries, small errors, emotional residue, half-formed impressions, and all the fragments that pile up in a day. The brain cannot treat each fragment as equally important. It must discriminate. One of sleep's gifts may be that it creates conditions in which signal can be separated more effectively from noise. This is likely part of why sleep deprivation makes thinking feel muddy. It is not only that you are tired, it is that the system has not had its usual opportunity to recalibrate, sort, and trim. Emotional regulation is another area where the active nature of sleep becomes obvious. During the day, emotional life can become sticky. Experiences carry charge, a criticism stings, a mistake grows claws, a worry repeats itself, a conflict takes on more space than it deserves. Sleep seems to help recalibrate some of this. While the exact mechanisms remain an area of ongoing research, it is clear that poor sleep and emotional instability are closely linked. When people are sleep deprived, they tend to react more strongly to negative stimuli, struggle more with regulation, and find it harder to keep perspective. By contrast, healthy sleep supports the brain systems that help emotion remain proportional. That does not mean sleep erases pain or fixes every distress. It means that the sleeping brain is actively participating in emotional processing, not merely lying there while feelings marinate unattended. This helps explain a familiar human experience. Something that feels unbearable at night often feels at least somewhat more manageable in the morning. The external facts may not have changed. The message is still unsent. The deadline is still coming. The awkward comment still escaped your mouth and now lives in the social record. But your relationship to it has shifted. Part of that shift may come from daylight, food, movement, and the return of waking routines. But part of it likely reflects what sleep did. The brain spent the night not only restoring energy, but processing emotional context. It adjusted the internal climate in which the problem is being evaluated. Since problem solving depends heavily on emotion, this nighttime work matters. It matters physically too. The brain is metabolically active, and like any active organ, it produces waste products. During sleep, especially deep sleep, a system sometimes described as the brain's cleaning system appears to become more effective at clearing certain metabolic byproducts. This glymphatic activity has become a popular topic because it offers a satisfying image of overnight cleanup. As always, the details are more complicated than headlines would like, and research is ongoing, but the general idea is important. Sleep may help maintain the chemical environment in which healthy neural function depends. In other words, sleep is not only about thoughts and dreams, it is also about maintenance of the biological tissue that makes thought possible. That maintenance has consequences for the next day's cognition, attention, working memory, decision-making, creativity, and learning all suffer when sleep is reduced. This is not mysterious if sleep is active. If the brain has not completed many of its regular overnight processes, the waking mind starts the day underprepared. It is like expecting a kitchen to serve breakfast after the night staff were denied time to clean, restock, sharpen knives, prep ingredients, or repair the stove. Something will still happen, but it will not be pretty. You may get eggs, you may also get confusion. The same is true of a brain forced into wakefulness without sufficient sleep. It can still function. Humans are remarkably stubborn creatures, but the quality of that function changes. Another striking sign that sleep is active rather than empty is dreaming. Dreams are often bizarre, but they are also evidence of continued internal generation, simulation, and experience. The dreaming brain is not gone. It is producing scenes, narratives, sensations, emotions, and associations without direct input from the world. Even when dreams make no obvious sense, they show that the sleeping brain remains capable of astonishing complexity. During REM sleep especially, the brain is anything but silent. Activity increases in some areas involved in imagery, emotion, and memory, while certain prefrontal regions involved in strict logical control are less active. This helps explain why dreams can feel intense, vivid, and narratively unstable all at once. The brain is active, but active in a different configuration. This different configuration may be especially helpful for certain kinds of creative problem solving. Because the usual structures of waking control are loosened, associations can become broader and less constrained. Memory fragments can combine in novel ways. Emotional themes can surface symbolically. Practical concerns can appear in strange disguises. Most dream content is not useful in any direct sense. Let us be honest about that. If you dream that your old math teacher is driving a submarine through a supermarket while explaining your tax return, the universe is not necessarily sending refined guidance. Still, the associative looseness of dreaming hints at a brain willing to explore possibilities beyond waking logic. That flexibility can matter, even if the resulting content arrives in ridiculous packaging. Sleep's activity is also rhythmic and cyclical. The brain moves through repeating stages across the night, roughly cycling through non-REM and REM sleep with changing proportions. Early in the night, deep non-REM sleep tends to dominate. Later, REM periods become longer. This architecture suggests that sleep is not one uniform condition, with one single function. Different stages likely contribute differently to restoration, memory, emotion, and cognition. Deep sleep may be especially important for certain kinds of consolidation and physical restoration. REM may play larger roles in emotional processing, associative integration, and some forms of creativity. The exact mapping is still under investigation, but the broad principle is clear. The sleeping brain is not doing one thing. It is doing many things in sequence. That sequence also means that sleep quality matters, not just sleep quantity. A long night of fragmented, disrupted sleep is not the same as a long night of consolidated, healthy sleep. If the brain is repeatedly pulled out of stages before completing them properly, the night's work is compromised. This is one reason people can spend many hours in bed, yet still wake feeling unrefreshed, unfocused, or emotionally frayed. Time in bed is not identical to sleep, and sleep is not identical to effective overnight processing. The brain needs enough uninterrupted time to move through its cycles and complete the work those cycles support. One of the quieter marvels of this whole arrangement is that it happens without conscious supervision. You do not have to remember to consolidate your memories at 2:15 a.m. You do not set an alarm labelled recalibrate synaptic weights or clear metabolic waste from cortex. The sleeping brain runs these processes automatically, guided by systems shaped over evolutionary time. That automatic quality can make us underestimate it. We tend to admire what requires visible effort. Sleep requires surrender, which is not glamorous. It does not look like productivity. No one sends a triumphant message saying, "Fantastic news, I lay motionless for 8 hours and the hippocampus had a very successful night." And yet that may be one of the more intelligent things a person can do. Of course, sleep is not perfect. It does not always protect memory equally. It does not guarantee emotional healing. It does not solve every problem or produce insight on command. The sleeping brain is active but not obedient. It follows biological principles, not personal ambition. Still, the activity itself is real and powerful enough that depriving the brain of it comes with a cost. When people chronically cut sleep short, they are not merely sacrificing comfort. They are sacrificing an entire mode of brain function. They are asking the waking mind to perform without the benefits of the night shift. Sometimes it manages, over time it manages less well. There is also something philosophically pleasing about the fact that the brain never fully rests in the simple sense. We often divide life into action and rest, doing and not doing, effort and pause. Sleep blurs that distinction. It is restful for waking consciousness, and for the body in many ways, yes, but it is not nothing. It is full of hidden labour. The mind steps away from conscious control, and in doing so allows other forms of order to emerge. Memory is sorted, emotion is rebalanced, noise is reduced, patterns are strengthened, biological maintenance proceeds, and somewhere in all that activity, the ground is prepared for tomorrow's thinking. This has special importance for the question of how the brain solves problems while you sleep. If sleep were truly empty, the idea would make no sense. A blank brain cannot solve anything. But once we recognize that sleep is active, the question becomes not whether the brain can keep working at night, but how its nighttime work differs from daytime effort. During waking life, the brain is busy responding, selecting, controlling, and performing. During sleep, it is busy replaying, reorganizing, restoring, and integrating. Those are exactly the kinds of activities that can help transform a stuck problem into a solvable one. Sleep may not generate answers out of nothing, but it prepares the cognitive conditions in which answers become easier to find. That is why the quiet body in bed should never fool us. Stillness is not inactivity. Silence is not emptiness. The sleeping brain is alive with rhythms, adjustments, negotiations, and recalibrations. It is turning the day over in its hands. It is deciding what to keep and what to set down. It is reducing some connections, strengthening others, making room, clearing clutter, protecting what matters, and changing the emotional and cognitive terrain on which tomorrow's thoughts will stand. All of that happens while the room is dark and the outside world assumes nothing much is going on. So when you drift off and the visible self seems to disappear for the night, what vanishes is not activity but your direct command over it. The brain keeps going, it changes tasks, it moves inward, it begins the work that waking life leaves unfinished. And that is the deeper truth behind the phrase, the brain that never rests. It is not a warning, it is a reassurance. Even in sleep, especially in sleep, the mind remains at work in ways that help make morning possible, ways that will matter even more once we begin looking at how the sleeping brain starts sorting the day it has just lived through. By the time night arrives, the brain is carrying far more than it appears to be carrying. A single day may look simple from the outside. You woke up, moved through familiar spaces, spoke to a few people, handled a task or two, forgot something minor, remembered something late, read a sentence that stayed with you, ignored another that did not, solved one problem, postponed 3 others, saw faces, heard names, noticed colours, felt irritation, relief, hunger, boredom, interest, and perhaps that very specific kind of regret that comes from opening the fridge, staring confidently inside, and realizing you have forgotten why you came there in the first place. None of this arrives in the brain as one neat bundle labelled Tuesday. It arrives as an ongoing flood of sensory input, emotional tone, partial meaning, relevant detail, irrelevant detail, and unfinished traces. If the brain tried to preserve it all equally, it would drown in its own bookkeeping. Instead, it spends the night sorting. That nighttime sorting is one of the most important reasons sleep is so useful for clear thinking. During the day, the brain is busy living through events. At night, it gains the chance to process them. This does not mean the sleeping brain simply replays the day, as if watching a documentary of your own life from beginning to end, complete with commentary and a tasteful soundtrack. The process is both more selective and more interesting than that. What the brain seems to do is revisit aspects of waking experience, strengthen some traces, weaken others, connect related pieces, separate signal from noise, and reorganize the whole collection so that what matters becomes more usable later. To understand why this is necessary, it helps to think again about how messy waking experience really is. Even the most ordinary hour contains an astonishing amount of information. There is the sensory layer, what you saw, heard, touched, smelled, and tasted. There is the attentional layer, what you focused on and what you ignored. There is the emotional layer, what felt pleasant, threatening, awkward, rewarding, dull, exciting, or significant. There is the interpretive layer, what you thought something meant at the time. Then there is the relational layer, how new events connect to older memories, habits, expectations, and personal concerns. All of this is being handled while you're also trying to function in real time. You're not calmly archiving the day as it happens. You're improvising your way through it. Because of that, What gets stored initially is often provisional. The brain captures enough to guide immediate behaviour, but much of that early encoding is unstable. It still needs to be evaluated. Was that detail important or disposable? Was that face worth remembering or merely adjacent to your sandwich? Was that strange remark from your colleague a meaningful clue about something, or just one of those odd little comments that humans produce while tired and near fluorescent lighting? The waking brain does not always know in the moment. Sleep offers a chance to revisit those traces under different conditions. One of the central players in this process is the hippocampus, a structure buried within the temporal lobe that is deeply involved in the formation of new episodic memories. You can think of it, roughly, as helping temporarily bind together the elements of an experience so that they can later be reactivated and stabilized. If you met someone new at lunch, the hippocampus helps link the visual features of their face, the sound of their name, the place you were sitting, the topic you discussed, and the fact that they inexplicably ordered sparkling water with soup. Without such binding, experience would remain fragmented. But hippocampal storage alone is not the end point. For memories to become more durable and more integrated into broader knowledge, they seem to require further processing, much of which happens during sleep. Researchers have long been interested in what appears to be replay during sleep. In animal studies, especially with rodents navigating mazes, scientists have observed that patterns of neural firing seen during waking behaviour can recur later during sleep. It is as though the brain is revisiting the experience after the fact. Importantly, this replay is not always a perfect slow retelling. Sometimes it is compressed, sometimes it is reorganized, sometimes it seems to occur in ways that suggest the brain is extracting or rehearsing useful structure rather than merely repeating exact events. This matters because replay may be part of how recent experience becomes more deeply learned. In humans, the evidence is necessarily more indirect, but the general picture is persuasive. Sleep supports memory consolidation. People tend to remember newly learned material better after sleep than after an equivalent time spent awake, especially when interference is controlled. Sleep seems to protect certain memories from being overwritten by the ongoing noise of life. It also appears to help the brain extract regularities from experience. That means the sleeping brain is not simply preserving what happened. It is beginning to understand what happened in a more general way. That distinction between details and structure is essential. Suppose you spend the afternoon learning a new task, perhaps a sequence of moves, a set of word pairs, or a hidden pattern inside a puzzle. During the learning itself, your attention may be focused on specific items. This symbol follows that one. This response belongs to that cue. This move works after that move. But over time, especially with sleep, the brain may begin to grasp the underlying structure that links the items together. The individual pieces become part of a larger pattern. Once the pattern is recognized, performance can improve dramatically. What looked like many separate facts becomes one organized rule. This is precisely the kind of thing that helps with problem solving. Problems often remain difficult because their pieces are not yet arranged correctly in the mind. You may know all the relevant facts, yet still fail to see how they fit. Sleep seems to support that fitting process. By replaying and reorganizing experience, the brain can reduce the clutter of surface detail and strengthen the relationships that matter most. In other words, the sleeping brain is not merely remembering the day, it is editing it. Editing, however, does not mean perfect judgment. The brain is not an impeccable librarian wearing spectacles and quietly filing every event under the correct heading. It is more like a very hard-working archivist trying to make sense of a truckload of papers delivered in the rain. Some items get preserved beautifully, some get misfiled, some are thrown out, some are woven into broader narratives that are useful but not entirely precise. Memory is constructive, not photographic, and sleep participates in that constructive work. That is one reason why it can help both memory and insight while also allowing distortion. The system is optimizing for usefulness, not historical perfection. There is also an economy to this process. The brain cannot keep everything at full strength. It must prioritize. Experiences tagged by emotion, novelty, relevance, repetition, or future usefulness may receive more protection and reinforcement. Other material may fade. This selectivity can feel frustrating when what fades turns out to be the one name you needed, the one number you were sure you would remember, or the exact sentence you wished you had written down. But from the brain's perspective, forgetting is not always failure. It is often efficiency. A mind that kept everything equally would be overwhelmed. The art lies in keeping enough of the right things. Sleep appears to be one of the times when that art is practiced. During slow-wave sleep, especially in the earlier part of the night, the large synchronized oscillations of the cortex and the coordinated activity involving the hippocampus seem well suited to consolidation. Sleep spindles, those brief bursts of rhythmic activity seen especially in stage N2, are also strongly associated with learning and memory. Their exact roles are still being studied, but they appear to help stabilize new information and support communication between brain regions. If you wanted a simple image, you might think of the sleeping brain as intermittently opening brief windows during which recently encoded material can be reprocessed and integrated. The science is more complex than the image, but the image is useful. What makes this even more interesting is that reprocessing is not only about strengthening what happened, it is also about transforming it. Over time, the brain often shifts from preserving the exact context of a memory toward retaining its gist, meaning, or relevance. This is why people may forget the precise wording of a conversation while clearly remembering what the conversation was about, or forget the exact route they learned while retaining a sense of the layout. Sleep seems to contribute to that shift. It helps memories become less fragile and more generalized. That generalization is one of the foundations of intelligence. If you had to relearn every situation from scratch, without extracting patterns from prior cases, life would be almost impossible. You would be forever opening doors as if the concept of a handle were a rumor. Pattern extraction is especially valuable when the day includes information you did not consciously realize you were learning. Human brains are constantly picking up statistical regularities from the environment, which sounds tend to go together, which visual features predict a category, which social cues precede a certain reaction, which roads usually become crowded at which hour. Much of this learning is implicit. You do not sit there narrating it to yourself like an overconfident detective. You simply absorb it. Later, sleep may help strengthen these hidden learnings, making them available as intuition, fluency, or sudden recognition. This is one reason that a person can wake up with a new sense that something is obvious without being entirely sure why. The answer was not necessarily missing before. It may simply have been buried inside partially sorted experience. Overnight, the brain replayed relevant traces, increased the weight of certain associations, and reduced interference from less useful material. By morning, the structure feels clearer. The person experiences this as a fresh thought, but the groundwork may have been laid across many sleeping passes through the material. Another part of sorting the day involves separating what belongs to the self's ongoing story from what was merely passing background. Much of memory is not just about facts, but about significance. Did this event matter to my goals, my safety, my relationships, my identity, my future decisions? Sleep seems to be one of the times when the brain assesses these priorities. Emotional events are especially interesting in this regard. Strong feeling tends to increase the likelihood that an event will be remembered, but sleep may also help regulate how that event is remembered. It may strengthen the factual components while softening some of the raw physiological charge, though the details of this process are still being explored. In practical terms, sleep can help turn an immediate emotional experience into a more manageable memory rather than leaving it forever in its original volume. That does not always happen quickly or perfectly, of course. Painful experiences can remain painfully vivid. Trauma can disrupt the normal processes of sleep and memory in severe ways. The brain is not a guaranteed healer simply because night has fallen. Still, in ordinary daily life, sleep often helps emotional experiences become more organized and less chaotic. The argument you had, the embarrassment you felt, the worry you carried home, the praise you received but did not quite know how to accept, all of these may be subtly reshaped overnight. They become part of memory not as raw live wires, but as more structured material. When sleep is absent or poor, this sorting process suffers. That is one reason sleep deprivation can make life feel mentally cluttered. Recent experiences remain noisy, emotional reactions stay sharper, attention becomes less reliable, memory becomes patchier. The brain has had less opportunity to tidy its own workspace. Anyone who has tried to learn something difficult while exhausted knows the feeling. Information seems to go in and evaporate. The next day, nothing is where you thought you left it. It is as if the mind hosted a party, forgot to clean up, and then expected to function as a serious place of business by morning. A well-slept brain is not just more energetic, it is more ordered. Order here does not mean rigid neatness. It means that useful traces are accessible, irrelevant traces are less intrusive, and relationships between memories have been adjusted in ways that support future thinking. Consider what happens when you study a topic one evening and then return to it the next morning. Very often it feels more familiar than it did at the end of the study session itself. Material that was shaky has become steadier. What you struggle to retrieve now comes more readily. That is not only because time has passed, it is because sleep has worked on the traces. There is something almost architectural about this. The day provides bricks, wood, wires, loose plans, and a few questionable design decisions. Sleep is when some of that material gets assembled into something more stable. Not finished perhaps, but inhabitable. The brain does not merely pile up experiences, it builds with them. And building requires periods when new materials are not constantly arriving at full speed. Sleep supplies that protected interval. External demand falls. Internal organization rises. This organization also involves relationships across time. The brain does not store today as an isolated island. It continuously compares new information with old memories, categories, and expectations. Was this event similar to something before? Does it update an old belief? Does it contradict a previous pattern? Does it belong to a known category or suggest a new one? Sleep helps with this integration. A new experience can be fitted into older knowledge structures, making it more understandable and more retrievable later. Without that integration, memory would remain fragmented and learning would be terribly inefficient. It is worth pausing on how extraordinary this is. Every night, without conscious supervision, the brain revisits the day and asks versions of very sophisticated questions. What mattered? What belongs together? What predicts what? What should remain vivid? What can fade? What part of this was specific and what part was general? What does this remind me of? What does it change? You do not hear these questions being asked, but the answers shape the next day's mind. The sleeping brain is an organizer of lived experience. And organizers, of course, are selective. There is always some loss. Exact details fade, events are compressed, timelines become blurred, small features disappear. This can sound unfortunate, but it is also what allows abstraction. Imagine trying to understand the concept of dog, while remembering every dog only as a totally separate, unconnected incident. You would never arrive at the category. You would simply have a long list of fur-related encounters. Abstraction requires the mind to notice shared structure across multiple experiences. Sleep supports that process by helping stabilize patterns, rather than merely preserving isolated episodes. This is one reason children, who are learning enormous amounts about the structure of the world, need so much sleep. They are not just physically growing, their brains are sorting vast quantities of new information, language patterns, social rules, object categories, movement skills, emotional signals, causal expectations. All of it needs organizing. Adults, though usually better at pretending competence, are doing the same on a smaller scale every day. Every new task, conversation, environment, or difficulty adds material to be sorted, sleep remains the interval in which much of that sorting becomes possible. There is also an elegant asymmetry between the day and the night. During the day, the world acts on you. During the night, the brain acts on the day. That is not perfectly literal, but it captures something essential. Wakefulness is when you gather experience. Sleep is when experience is processed into knowledge. If wakefulness were all intake and no organization, life would become a meaningless pile. If sleep were all organization without new input, nothing fresh would ever arrive. Intelligence depends on both. The brain needs to encounter the world and later rearrange what it encountered. When people say that sleeping on a problem helps, this is part of what they mean, whether they realize it or not. The problem is rarely just sitting there alone in the mind. It's embedded in a whole day's worth of related impressions, facts, frustrations, and attempted solutions. Sleep helps sort that whole cluster. It may strengthen the useful parts of your attempt and let the useless parts fade slightly. It may connect the problem to older memories or ideas that were not accessible while you were consciously trying too hard. It may reduce emotional noise enough for the structure of the issue to stand out more clearly. The answer, when it comes, can feel sudden, but the night's work was gradual. Dreams may sometimes reflect pieces of this process, though not in a straightforward way. A person may dream of fragments from the day, mixed with older memories, current concerns, and absurd additions that no respectable waking mind would approve. This mixture has led some researchers to think of dreams as one visible expression of memory processing and emotional integration. That does not mean every dream is a coded lesson. It means the dreaming mind often shows the brain handling recent material in a flexible, associative way. The day is being broken apart and recombined. Sometimes that recombination is nonsense. Sometimes it reveals a connection that waking thought had missed. Still, much of the sorting work of sleep happens silently, below awareness. You do not need to remember dreaming in order for sleep to help memory and organization. In fact, some of the most important forms of consolidation appear closely linked to non-REM processes that do not necessarily produce vivid dream recall. The usefulness of sleep does not depend on your ability to wake and say, "Excellent, I had a highly informative symbolic narrative involving a train station and 3 unsuitable umbrellas." The work goes on regardless, and that work is cumulative. One good night helps, but the brain's organization of experience is ongoing. Over many nights, repeated replay and integration can turn fragile learning into robust understanding. A skill becomes fluent. A concept becomes intuitive. A person's sense of a problem deepens. This is why mastery of difficult material usually requires repeated cycles of effort and sleep. Cramming everything into one exhausted evening may create a brief illusion of productivity. But without sleep, the material often remains unstable. The brain needs time not only to receive information but to build it into itself. So by the time morning arrives, the day before has already been changed. Not erased, not perfectly archived, but transformed. Some details have been strengthened, others softened. Some relationships have become clearer. Some emotional edges have been sanded down. Some hidden patterns have become more available. The brain that wakes is not carrying the same raw bundle of experience that went to bed. It is carrying a more organized version of it. That organized version becomes the starting point for new thought. It is why recall feels easier after sleep. It is why learning often improves. It is why some puzzles loosen overnight. It is why the phrase, "let me sleep on it," remains one of the more intelligent things a person can say. Sleep is not dead time between one day and the next. It is the period in which one day is made usable for the next one. The brain replays, edits, strengthens, trims, and arranges. It turns lived fragments into something closer to knowledge. And once those fragments have been sorted well enough, something even more interesting becomes possible. The brain can begin to see relationships that were not obvious before. It can move beyond simply organizing the day and start finding hidden links within it. The sort of links that often lie behind insight itself. problem rarely stays in the form you first notice it. That is one of the quiet tricks of thinking. You may begin with what feels like a clear difficulty. A sentence is not working. A decision feels impossible. An idea seems incomplete. A conversation is stuck in your head. A design does not fit together. A melody almost works, but not quite. A plan has too many moving parts. A name will not come back. A reason remains just outside reach. At first, it seems obvious what the problem is. Then, if you remain with it long enough, especially if you stop pressing on it directly and allow sleep to enter the story, something subtler can happen. The problem shifts shape. Not outwardly, perhaps. The facts may remain the same, but the way the brain is holding those facts begins to change. And that change, more than brute effort, is often what opens the door to a solution. This is one of the most useful things sleep appears to do for thought. It does not simply preserve experience or strengthen memory. It can alter the frame through which a problem is being viewed. That alteration is often invisible while it is happening. You go to bed feeling stuck in one mental arrangement. You wake up and, without any fanfare, the arrangement is different. A connection that was hidden seems plain. An assumption that felt necessary no longer feels necessary. Two ideas that had lived in separate rooms of the mind now seem to belong together. The answer may still require work, but the problem is no longer trapped in the same old shape. We often imagine insight as dramatic, a bolt of realization, a sudden cry of triumph. The person sits upright in bed, illuminated by genius, and writes down a revolutionary idea before breakfast. That does happen sometimes, and it makes for good stories, but more often the reframing is quieter. A sentence comes more easily. A choice feels more obvious. A solution that seemed complicated now seems almost embarrassingly simple. You may not even realize that the brain changed the frame overnight. You only notice that what felt stuck no longer feels quite so stuck. Why does this happen? Part of the answer lies in the fact that waking thought can be rigid without realizing it. When you're consciously trying to solve something, you tend to hold on to the first framing that made sense. If a task looks like a logic problem, you approach it with logic. If it feels emotional, you approach it through emotion. If a sentence seems wrong, you keep changing the same part of the sentence. If a conversation feels tense, you replay the same lines and the same injuries. Conscious effort is useful, but it is also conservative. It prefers familiar routes. It uses the same categories repeatedly. It narrows attention to what seems most relevant and suppresses the rest. That narrowing helps with focus, but it can also trap you inside a limited view. Sleep loosens that grip. As the brain cycles through different states across the night, the balance between focus control and broader association changes. The strict supervisory style of waking cognition relaxes. Memory traces are replayed. Emotional tone may shift. Distant associations may become more available. The brain is no longer trying to perform a solution in real time. It is not standing under bright lights trying to justify every thought. It can move more freely through stored material. That freedom appears to be one reason hidden connections become easier to find. A hidden connection is not necessarily something mystical. Usually it is something you already possessed in pieces but had not yet brought together. Perhaps the wording of a problem has made you focus on the wrong feature. Perhaps a useful memory sits nearby but has been blocked by a stronger, less relevant memory. Perhaps an emotional reaction is causing you to overestimate one risk and ignore another. Perhaps the answer requires treating two apparently separate issues as one issue. Perhaps the problem is not what should I do, but what am I assuming I have to protect? Or not, how do I finish this, but why did I define finished in such a narrow way? These are reframings. The external world may remain unchanged, yet the mental geometry shifts. That mental geometry is a good phrase for it. The brain does not hold every problem as a list of facts. It holds problems as patterns of emphasis, expectation, relevance, and relationship. Some elements are mentally close together, others are far apart. Some are bright and dominant. Others are faint. Some are treated as fixed. Others as movable. The geometry determines what kinds of solutions feel possible. If the wrong elements are grouped too tightly, new routes remain hidden. Sleep seems to help by redrawing parts of that map. Consider the familiar experience of searching for a word that will not come. During the day, the more you force it, the worse it becomes. You know the word is there somewhere. You can feel its contour, its meaning, perhaps even its first letter. Yet each attempt seems to produce only wrong answers that crowd around the missing one and make it harder to find. Then you stop trying. Later, sometimes hours later, the word surfaces on its own. Why? In part because direct retrieval effort can get trapped in a local network of competing associations. Sleep and other forms of incubation may help weaken the dominance of the wrong competitors and allow the correct path to become accessible. The brain did not invent the word, it simply stopped blocking itself from finding it. On a larger scale, the same principle can apply to complex problems. If you spend all evening trying to improve a piece of writing, you may become locked into the exact rhythm, tone, or wording that first emerged. Every revision then happens inside the same narrow corridor. You keep changing furniture in a room whose architecture is the real problem. Sleep may help because the architecture itself becomes less fixed. By morning you may see that the opening is wrong, not the third sentence, or that the structure is fine and the tone is wrong, or that the whole thing has been trying to answer the wrong question. Such realizations can feel sudden, but they often depend on the brain having loosened and recombined elements of the task overnight. This overnight recombination is especially interesting because the sleeping brain seems willing to connect material that waking thought keeps apart. During the day, categories are useful. Work is work, memory is memory, emotion is emotion. Past and present are neatly labelled, at least most of the time. During sleep, especially in more dream-rich states, those separations soften. Recent experiences may mingle with remote memories. Abstract concerns may appear as images. Personal worries may be woven into older narratives. A practical problem may borrow features from something unrelated. This does not mean dreams deliver clean symbolic truth in every case. Often they are gloriously unhelpful. But the looseness itself is important. It reveals that the brain is operating with wider associative reach. Wider associative reach is one of the ingredients of creativity. Creativity is often described as producing something new, but in cognitive terms it frequently involves combining existing elements in unfamiliar but meaningful ways. A new idea is rarely created from nothing. It emerges from recombination. What sleep may offer is a setting in which recombination becomes easier, because the usual constraints are reduced. The mind is less tied to the exact framing that dominated waking effort. It can move from one cluster of memories to another more flexibly, and in doing so it may stumble upon relations that conscious thought had screened out. There is evidence for this in studies of insight problems, especially those where the key is not more effort but a shift in representation. Some tasks are difficult because people apply an obvious but wrong rule. Once that rule is abandoned, the answer becomes much easier. Sleep appears to help with such tasks more than with tasks that simply require repeated brute calculation. That fits well with the idea that sleep supports restructuring rather than mere repetition. It helps the brain see the task differently, and seeing differently is often what solves the problem. Think of those visual puzzles where one image can suddenly be seen in two distinct ways. At first, you see only one interpretation. Then, once the second interpretation appears, you cannot quite believe it was hidden for so long. The lines on the page never changed. Only the organization of perception changed. Many cognitive problems are like that. The information is present, but the organizing assumption keeps one interpretation dominant. Sleep may help loosen that dominance. There is another reason hidden connections become easier to find at night or after sleep. Waking thought is deeply influenced by immediate goals. That sounds obvious, but it matters more than we tend to notice. If your goal is to finish a task quickly, you prioritize speed and closure. If your goal is to avoid embarrassment, you prioritize safety. If your goal is to prove yourself right, you selectively attend to confirming evidence. Goals shape what the brain treats as relevant. They can therefore create blindness. The sleeping brain is not pursuing your daytime agenda in quite the same way. It is not trying to impress anyone. It is not hurrying. It is not clinging to the ego's favourite storyline. That can make it surprisingly useful. It is less disciplined. But sometimes discipline is exactly what kept the answer hidden. Emotional reframing is part of this too. Many problems remain stuck because they are emotionally overdefined. An unanswered message is not just an unanswered message. It becomes rejection, uncertainty, insult, self-doubt, history, hope, fear, and mild catastrophe all at once. In such a state, the problem is difficult to examine clearly because each possible interpretation is loaded. Sleep often reduces that loading somewhat. The brain returns the next day with the issue less fused to immediate emotion. Once the feeling softens even a little, alternative interpretations become easier to entertain. That is reframing in one of its most humane forms. Nothing has been denied. The mind has simply regained room to move. That regained room can reveal that the problem was misnamed all along. People often believe they are trying to answer one question when they are actually trapped inside another. Should I leave? May secretly be, am I allowed to disappoint someone? Why can't I finish this project? May secretly be, why does finishing feel like losing other possibilities? How do I fix this relationship? May secretly be, can I bear the version of myself who does not get chosen? These deeper framings are not always comfortable, and sleep does not invariably reveal them in language. More often it changes the emotional arrangement enough that the real issue begins to show through. You wake with a different sense of where the difficulty actually lives. This is one reason the phrase "sleeping on it" is wiser than it sounds. People often interpret it as a delay tactic, a polite way of saying they do not want to decide yet. But cognitively it can be a genuine method. By postponing action and allowing sleep to intervene, you permit the mind to loosen from its immediate frame. That does not guarantee a better answer, but it often produces a better question. And a better question is sometimes the greatest progress available. There is also a practical advantage in the way sleep alters salience. Salience is what stands out, what grabs attention, what feels important. During the day, salience can be distorted by stress, urgency, novelty, and mood. The most emotionally charged detail may dominate the problem even if it is not the most informative detail. Sleep can adjust that balance. By morning, a previously overlooked aspect may seem more central, while the old dramatic feature seems oddly secondary. This can be deeply clarifying. Many people have had the experience of being obsessed at night with one element of a problem, only to wake and realize that element was not, in fact, the thing at all. A tired mind tends to cling. A rested mind tends to compare. That difference is crucial. When you are fatigued, cognitive flexibility decreases. The brain conserves effort by returning to familiar routes and familiar interpretations. It becomes harder to shift mental set. This is one reason exhaustion makes people both more certain and less accurate. They are not seeing broadly enough to revise the frame. Sleep helps restore that broader capacity. Once flexibility returns, the hidden connection can emerge because the brain is finally willing to compare across categories rather than digging the same trench deeper. Memory networks also matter here. Thoughts do not live as isolated units. They exist within large networks of association. One concept activates neighbouring concepts which activate others, and so on. Some routes are well worn, others are faint. During waking effort, especially under pressure, activation may stay trapped in the strongest and most obvious parts of the network. That is efficient but limiting. Sleep may help by altering the balance of activation and making more remote associations accessible. In simpler terms, the brain may become more likely to link the current problem with something from a different domain, a different time, or a different emotional context. Those remote links are often where insight lives. Think of an inventor wrestling with a mechanical problem. and waking with an idea borrowed unconsciously from some unrelated bodily rhythm, animal movement, or remembered tool. Or a writer stuck on an argument and waking with a structural solution that came not from logic alone but from some older narrative form. Or an ordinary person trying to decide how to handle a conflict and waking with the sudden realization that the present situation feels familiar because it resembles a much older relational pattern. These are all examples of hidden connections becoming available. The sleeping brain did not politely announce its method, it simply rearranged the field. Because this process is so quiet, people often underestimate it. They credit the morning self and forget the night's work. A person says, "I just suddenly knew what to do." But sudden knowing is often the felt experience of a long, invisible preparation. The preparation may include the day's effort, of course. Sleep does not replace deliberate thought. It uses it. The brain can only reframe material it has. That is why struggling with a problem before sleep can sometimes help more than ignoring it entirely. You provide the pieces. Sleep reorganizes the board. Still, not every problem benefits equally. Some require direct external action, more information, or better conditions rather than internal reframing. If you cannot solve a math error because one of the numbers is wrong in the textbook, no amount of elegant REM sleep will correct the printing. If you are trying to understand a legal issue you have never studied, sleep cannot substitute for actual knowledge. But even in those cases, sleep may help you realize what kind of missing piece you truly need. It can reframe confusion into a more precise question, and that is no small gain. Dreams sometimes provide a glimpse of the brain's reframing style. Their logic is associative rather than linear. A concern about money may become a leaking roof. Social anxiety may become arriving barefoot to an exam you were apparently supposed to take on a moving train. A complicated work problem may appear as a maze, a conversation, a locked room, or a ridiculous animal with suspicious authority. The details are often absurd, but the transformations reveal something. The brain is not preserving problems in their literal daytime shape. It is translating them, mixing them, and exploring them under altered rules. Most of these translations are not directly useful, but the capacity behind them is. It shows a system willing to search broadly through metaphor, memory, and emotion. And broad search can be exactly what a stuck problem needs. Problems become stuck when search is too narrow. You keep trying the same interpretation, the same solution class, the same emotional stance. Sleep broadens the search. It does not do so neatly or transparently, which is why it can feel mysterious, but the result may be a morning in which new routes feel available. You are still yourself. The world is still itself. Yet there is more room between the pieces. This is especially valuable in creative work, where the wrong framing can be fatal. A song is not fixed because the second verse is weak. It may be weak because the emotional perspective is wrong. A video is not failing because the middle section drags. It may drag because the whole structure has been defined too literally. An argument is not unresolved because the final point is insufficient. It may be unresolved because the audience has been asked the wrong question from the start. Sleep can help creative minds because it permits a less defensive relationship to the material. The creator wakes slightly less fused to their first version. That distance is often what allows revision to become intelligent instead of merely restless. Distance, in fact, may be one of sleep's greatest gifts. Not detachment in the cold sense, but enough psychological distance for the mind to see what it was too close to see before. When you're tangled in a problem, every piece presses at once. Sleep untangles a little. It does not remove investment. It reduces saturation. You return with more perspective, and perspective is a form of reframing. There is also an honesty to the sleeping brain that waking pride sometimes resists. During the day, we defend our frames because they are tied to identity. We do not want to be wrong. We do not want to rethink what we have spent hours building. We do not want to admit that the whole question was badly posed. Sleep does not care about these vanities. It cares about patterns, associations, needs, emotion, regulation, memory, and future function. If the frame is poor, the sleeping brain may quietly weaken its hold. By morning, what felt indispensable may seem strangely optional. This is not betrayal, it is adaptation. That adaptation is one reason so many seemingly unsolvable personal dilemmas soften after rest. The immediate emotional narrative stops being the only narrative. The brain, having sorted and compared more broadly, offers alternatives. Perhaps the person is not angry but hurt. Perhaps the task is not impossible but undefined. Perhaps the decision is not between courage and cowardice, but between two different losses. Perhaps what seemed like failure is actually grief, or exhaustion, or misfit. These are not small distinctions. They are often the distinctions that make action possible. So when we speak of hidden connections, we're really speaking about the mind's ability to reorganize meaning. Sleep supports that ability by loosening rigid control, reprocessing memory, adjusting emotional charge, broadening associative reach, and restoring flexibility. The result is not always a dazzling revelation. Often it is something more modest, and therefore more useful. A problem seen from a truer angle. You may notice this the next time you go to bed tangled in something, and wake with an odd little sentence in your head. Something like, "Oh, that's what this is really about," or "That is not the question I need to answer," or even, "Actually, I do know the next step." Those moments can feel almost suspiciously simple, but simplicity often arrives only after hidden complexity has been quietly rearranged. And once the brain has begun finding those hidden links, another ability comes into view, one even closer to the experience people often describe after a good night's sleep. The sudden sense that a real solution has surfaced, not just a better frame, but an actual insight assembled from memory, pattern, and connection, while the conscious mind was away. There is a particular kind of morning thought that feels almost magical, though it is usually built from very ordinary materials. You wake, lie there a moment, and something that was stubborn the night before now seems unexpectedly clear. A sentence arrives, a design flaw reveals itself, a name surfaces, a choice that felt impossible now looks almost obvious, a problem you were pushing against with great determination and very little success has somehow shifted while you were asleep. You did not consciously work on it. You were not sitting at a desk, frowning at notes, heroically underlining things. You were in bed, unconscious, occasionally twitching, and perhaps having a dream in which none of the relevant people were behaving properly. And yet the answer, or something close to an answer, appears. It is one of the most familiar and strangest experiences in mental life. When people talk about sleeping on a problem, this is often the moment they mean. Not just feeling calmer in the morning, though that matters. Not just remembering more clearly, though that matters too. They mean the feeling that the mind has done real cognitive work in the dark. The solution seems to have arrived overnight. That phrasing is not entirely wrong, but it can be misleading. It makes it sound as though the brain built a finished product from nothing while you were away. More often, what happened is that memory, pattern detection, and reorganization interacted across sleep in a way that made insight possible. The answer did not descend from nowhere. It emerged because the brain had been quietly rearranging what it already knew. Insight has a dramatic reputation. We tend to picture it as a sudden flash, a clean break from confusion to understanding. In some ways, that is true. The subjective feeling of insight is often abrupt. One moment the answer is hidden, the next it feels obvious. But the hidden labour behind that moment is usually gradual. Memory traces have to be preserved, related pieces have to be connected, irrelevant features have to lose some of their grip, and the deeper structure of the problem has to become more visible. Sleep seems to support all of those conditions. It is not a machine that produces genius on command, but it is remarkably good at creating the internal environment in which insight can happen. To understand why, it helps to begin with memory. Memory is not a warehouse where facts sit quietly on shelves waiting to be retrieved. It is an active, reconstructive system. Experiences are encoded in partial, distributed ways. Later, those traces can be strengthened, modified, linked to older knowledge, or reshaped into more general patterns. That reshaping matters because insight usually depends on more than remembering one thing. It depends on seeing how several remembered things belong together. In other words, the brain has to preserve pieces of information and also discover the relationships among them. During waking life, that relational work is often incomplete. You gather facts, impressions, attempts, and partial solutions. You may try several routes through a problem and fail. Each attempt leaves traces. Some are useful, some are misleading, some are only fragments of something more important. As night begins, the brain is carrying all of it. Sleep then seems to help in two broad ways. First, it supports consolidation, which means recent experiences become more stable and less vulnerable to fading or interference. Second, it supports abstraction and integration, which means the brain can move beyond isolated details and begin extracting patterns. That second part is where insight often lives. A problem is not always solved by remembering more details. Sometimes it is solved by noticing the rule beneath the details. Imagine trying to understand a sequence without seeing the pattern that governs it. Each new item feels separate and difficult. Once the pattern becomes clear, the whole sequence reorganizes in your mind. You no longer have to force each step individually. The structure does some of the work for you. Sleep appears to help with this transition from separate items to organized pattern. There is a reason that many laboratory studies of sleep and cognition focus not just on recall, but on hidden regularities. Participants might learn material without being told the rule that organizes it. After sleep, they are sometimes more likely to discover that rule or show improved performance that suggests the brain has extracted structure from the experience. This is deeply relevant to real life because many of the problems people care about are not solved by brute memory alone. They are solved by recognizing structure. Why does this strategy keep failing? What is common to these seemingly different cases? Which feature actually matters? What assumption have I repeated without noticing? Pattern detection is often the bridge between confusion and insight. A sleeping brain may be especially suited to this kind of bridge building because it is not tied as tightly to the exact surface form in which a problem was first encountered. During the day, you may be trapped by the wording of the issue, the emotion around it, or the first interpretation that came to mind. During sleep, the problem can be reprocessed in more flexible ways. The brain may strengthen the gist of a problem while weakening irrelevant details. It may connect new information to older, more general knowledge. It may allow remote associations to become more available. By morning, the structure stands out more clearly because the clutter around it has been reduced. This reduction of clutter is easy to underestimate. We often imagine thinking as the accumulation of more and more content, as though progress comes from adding pieces until the answer appears. But many stuck problems are not suffering from too little content. They are suffering from too much undifferentiated content. The mind is crowded with attempts, worries, details, and competing cues. Sleep may help by reducing interference. That is, it may make useful information easier to access not by increasing its absolute amount, but by lowering the noise around it. This can make the overnight appearance of insight feel uncanny. The answer seems to have been hidden behind a curtain, and in a sense it was. Sleep simply opened the curtain a little. Consider the experience of studying something difficult in the evening. At the end of the session, your understanding feels patchy. You can sense the pieces but not the whole. Then, after sleep, the material feels more coherent. You may still need effort to use it well, but the internal organization is improved. That improvement is not just stronger storage, it is often better access to the pattern. What was previously a bag of parts has become more like a system. That is one of the reasons why sleep is so critical to learning. It does not merely protect yesterday's effort, it converts effort into a form the brain can use more intelligently. This helps explain why solutions sometimes appear overnight, even when the person was not consciously close to them before bed. The brain may have had the necessary ingredients already, but those ingredients had not yet been arranged into a usable pattern. Sleep, by supporting replay and reorganization, increases the chance that the arrangement will improve. It is as though the brain spends the night trying different groupings of the material until one of them suddenly has explanatory power. When that grouped structure becomes accessible to waking consciousness, it feels like a new idea. In one sense, it is new. In another sense, it is a newly visible relationship among old elements. There is something wonderfully ordinary about this. We're tempted to reserve insight for great creative breakthroughs, the famous scientist, the composer, the inventor, the novelist staring into middle distance with historical seriousness. But insight happens at all levels of life. You wake knowing how to phrase an email without sounding colder than you intend. You realize the task at work has one bottleneck and 3 unnecessary complications. You suddenly see that the reason a room feels wrong is not the furniture but the lighting. You understand why a conversation with a friend keeps replaying in your head. You remember the one ingredient missing from dinner. These are not dramatic discoveries, but they rely on the same broad principle. Sleep helps the brain convert scattered information into more coherent pattern. Memory contributes to this in another important way. The brain does not search only within recent experience. It can link recent material to older memories, categories, and skills. A current problem may become solvable because sleep helps connect it to something learned long ago, but not consciously considered. This is part of what makes overnight solutions feel surprising. The answer sometimes seems to come from nowhere, because it comes from somewhere you were not intentionally looking. The brain, less constrained by waking focus, may recruit a broader range of stored experience. A problem in one domain may be illuminated by a memory from another. A practical dilemma may be helped by an older emotional lesson. A creative block may be loosened by a forgotten image, phrase, or structure that becomes newly relevant. Remote associations are often central to insight. The most obvious connections are usually the first ones waking thought tries. When those fail, progress may depend on reaching beyond the strongest and nearest associations toward weaker, more distant ones. Sleep seems well suited to that because it changes the balance of control and association. The vigilant, task-focused systems of the waking brain loosen their hold. Other relationships previously overshadowed have a better chance of emerging. This does not mean the sleeping brain is wiser in every respect. It is messier, freer, and often absurd. But that looseness can be extremely useful when the problem requires a connection that strict logic on its own kept missing. You can see hints of this process in dreams, though dreams are not always the most reliable messengers. A person may go to bed thinking about a technical issue and dream instead of a flooded house, an old classmate, 3 misplaced spoons, and a dog that seems deeply unimpressed by everyone. On the surface, this is not promising. Yet dreams show that the sleeping brain is capable of combining current concerns with distant memories and emotional themes in a way that waking thought usually suppresses. Most of the resulting combinations are not directly useful. Still, the same associative flexibility that produces nonsense can also support real connections. The brain is exploring, mixing, and testing relations beyond the narrow corridor of conscious effort. It is also important that sleep changes emotional context. Many problems are not only intellectual, they are emotionally tangled. Fear of failure, urgency, embarrassment, self-protection, hope, resentment, and fatigue all distort what seems possible. A person may have the information needed for a solution but be too emotionally constricted to recognize it. Overnight, some of that constriction may ease. The problem no longer feels as threatening. Once the emotional charge softens, a better pattern becomes visible. This can make the solution appear more rational in the morning, but what really changed was the emotional climate in which reasoning occurred. There is a useful humility in recognizing this. People like to imagine that thought is at its best when it is purely deliberate and fully conscious. But some of our most effective cognitive work happens when control is reduced, when the mind is not trying so hard to be correct in the moment. Sleep shows that intelligence is not only the ability to reason directly, it is also the ability of the brain to incubate, reorganize, and discover structure outside conscious awareness. That may not flatter the ego, but it does reflect the actual complexity of cognition. This complexity also explains why insight cannot be forced. You can prepare for it. You can feed the brain useful material, define the problem clearly enough, work hard enough to gather the pieces, and then allow sleep to do its part. But you cannot demand that the brain present a finished revelation by 8 in the morning, like a punctual but eccentric employee. Sometimes the answer comes, sometimes only part of it comes. Sometimes what arrives is not a solution but a better question, or a clearer sense of what is missing. That still matters. Insight is not always a final answer. Often it is a shift toward the right pattern. Think about how often knowing what the problem really is feels like half the solution. A person may spend hours trying to make a decision between 2 options, only to wake and realize that the real issue is not the options, but the standard by which they were judging them. Or they may be stuck on how to finish something and wake with the recognition that the project does not need expansion, only subtraction. Or they may be trying to remember a detail and wake instead with the context that makes the detail retrievable. These are insights because they reveal structure. The solution becomes possible because the brain has moved from content to pattern. This movement from content to pattern is one of the most important roles of sleep and cognition. During the day, you live through particulars. At night, the brain has a chance to ask what these particulars have in common, how they relate, and which ones matter most. The answer is not always explicit. You do not hear the brain saying, "After careful analysis, I have determined that the third example contradicts your original framing." You simply wake and feel the contradiction. The relationship is now present as an intuition, a clearer sense, a path that feels right. Later, you may translate that into language, but the pattern often becomes available before the explanation does. This can feel suspiciously like magic. It is not magic. It is what a pattern-detecting organ does when given time, cycling, altered chemistry, reduced external interference, and access to stored material across different layers of memory. The brain is built to find regularities. It does this constantly in perception, movement, language, and social understanding. Sleep does not create that ability. It gives it different conditions in which to operate. Under those conditions, hidden structure may emerge more readily than it does during the noisy, defensive, goal-pressured business of the day. There is also a cumulative dimension to this. Overnight insight often depends on previous nights of quieter work. A difficult subject studied over several days may not produce any dramatic revelation at first. Then, after enough cycles of effort and sleep, the understanding deepens enough that a new solution appears suddenly. The suddenness is partly real and partly an illusion created by threshold effects. The brain may have been approaching the necessary organization gradually until, at some point, the pattern crossed into conscious availability. The person experiences a leap, but the brain may have been climbing steadily all along. This is worth remembering whenever solutions do not arrive immediately. Sleep is helpful, but it is not theatrical on command. Sometimes its contribution is subtle. Sometimes it stabilizes memory rather than producing insight. Sometimes it strips away emotional distortion. Sometimes it increases fluency. Sometimes it reveals the outline of a pattern that will only become explicit after further waking work. All of these are valuable. The overnight appearance of a perfect answer is the most memorable version, but not the only one. Still, when that memorable version happens, it is delightful. There is a special pleasure in waking to a thought that seems cleaner than the one you had before bed. It feels like being met by your own mind in a better mood and better order. The frustration of the previous night has been replaced by a sense that the pieces belong together after all. Sometimes the solution is so clear that you wonder how you missed it. That feeling should not be mistaken for stupidity. Problems are often invisible from the wrong angle. Sleep helps rotate the object. It also helps that the morning brain, if well rested, is simply more capable of using insight when it appears. Poor sleep does not just reduce the chance of discovering patterns, it also reduces the capacity to hold and apply them. Working memory, attention, inhibition, and flexibility all suffer with sleep loss. So even if the brain did some hidden work, the exhausted waking mind may not be in a good position to capitalize on it. This is one of the quieter reasons sleep deprivation feels so defeating. It harms both the generation of clearer structure and the use of that structure once available. A rested mind, by contrast, is more receptive. The newly organized pattern can be held in awareness, tested, and translated into action. That is the second half of overnight insight. The sleeping brain prepares. The waking brain implements. One without the other is often insufficient. The night's work gives you the new arrangement. The day's work turns arrangement into decision, creation, or problem solved. This partnership between sleeping and waking cognition is one of the most elegant things about human thought. We do not solve problems only by pressing harder in consciousness. We solve them by alternating modes. We gather, struggle, attempt, fail, store, sleep, reorganize, and return. Memory provides the pieces. Pattern detection finds the shape. Insight is the moment the shape becomes usable. When a solution appears overnight, it is not because the brain has violated the rules of thought. It is because it has followed them very well in a mode your conscious self was not around to supervise. That may be why morning insight feels both intimate and foreign. It is your thought, obviously. No one else put it there, yet it arrives with a certain independence, as though another version of you had been quietly working while you were absent. In a sense, that is exactly what happened. Not another person, not a hidden genius in a waistcoat, but another mode of mind. One less verbal, less rigid, less defensive, and often better at turning fragments into form. And once the brain begins doing that reliably, once memory is being reorganized into pattern and pattern into insight, another question naturally follows. If solutions can appear overnight because sleep supports hidden structure, what role do dreams themselves play in that process, especially when they are so strange, so fragmented, and yet sometimes feel uncannily close to understanding? Dreams have a public relations problem. They are too strange to be trusted and too common to be ignored. If they were a little tidier, people might treat them like respectable mental events. If they were rarer, they might be greeted with more reverence. Instead, they arrive in the night wearing mismatched clothes and speaking in riddles. One dream offers a conversation with someone you have not seen in years. Another places you in your childhood home, except now it is also an airport, and for some reason you are late for an exam in a subject you do not study anymore, while carrying a lamp that feels, within the logic of the dream, incredibly important. Dreams can be vivid, emotional, absurd, repetitive, mundane, terrifying, funny, or all of those at once. Because they so often seem chaotic, people tend to place them in one of two boxes. Either dreams are treated as secret messages of immense importance, or they are dismissed as meaningless noise. The truth, as usual, is less dramatic and much more interesting. Dreams may not be neat prophecies or polished lessons, but they do appear to be part of a broader overnight process in which the brain is working with memory, emotion, association, and simulation. In that sense, dreams may be strange stories with a practical purpose. To understand that purpose, it helps to begin with a simple distinction. Dreaming is not the same thing as the entire work of sleep. Much of what sleep does for memory, restoration, and organization happens outside the vivid dream experiences people most remember. Dreams are one visible surface of a much larger set of nighttime processes. That is important because it keeps us from expecting too much literal wisdom from dream content. A dream is not usually a tidy report from the brain saying, "Good evening, I have now completed the following analysis of your unresolved situation. More often it is a side effect or expression of the brain processing material in a mode that is highly associative, emotionally coloured, and weakly constrained by waking logic. That can still be useful. It simply means usefulness must be understood properly. Dreams occur in multiple stages of sleep, though the vivid, narrative, emotionally intense dreams that people most often remember are especially associated with REM sleep. During REM, the brain shows a fascinating pattern. Some regions become highly active, particularly areas involved in imagery, emotion, memory, and internally generated experience. At the same time, certain prefrontal areas associated with strict executive control, critical evaluation, and orderly reasoning are relatively less active than in ordinary wakefulness. The result is a mind that can generate rich scenes and strong feeling without the same degree of logical supervision. This helps explain why dream worlds feel immersive and convincing, while also being full of impossible transitions, identity shifts, broken causality, and details that no waking editor would allow into print. That looser structure is not an accident. It is part of what makes dreams potentially useful. During the day, cognition is heavily shaped by immediate goals, external input, social rules, and the need to behave coherently in a shared world. Dreams are not under the same pressure. They can draw on fragments of recent experience, older memories, unresolved concerns, emotional themes, bodily sensations, and remote associations, then combine them in ways that waking thought would usually reject. Most of these combinations are not directly practical. A dream in which your dentist becomes your school principal and calmly informs you that the moon is overdue does not appear, at first glance, to improve your tax planning or communication skills. Yet the underlying process matters. The dreaming brain is exploring combinations, testing emotional patterns, and moving through stored material with unusual flexibility. This flexibility is one reason people have long suspected that dreams can sometimes help with creativity or problem solving. The suspicion is not entirely foolish. Because dreams loosen ordinary constraints, they can sometimes reveal a connection, perspective, or image that waking effort missed. Artists, writers, composers, and scientists have occasionally described ideas influenced by dreams or by the drowsy edge of sleep. The more sober scientific view is not that dreams are magical answer machines, but that the same sleep processes that support memory integration and flexible association may sometimes be experienced subjectively as dreams. In certain cases, that dream content can contain useful hints because it reflects the brain working with relevant material in a freer mode. Still, it is important not to romanticize dreams too quickly. Most dreams are not particularly instructive in any direct sense. They are partial, distorted, and often hard to interpret because the dreaming mind is not trying to communicate clearly. It is not writing a memo. It is generating experience. A dream may contain an emotional truth without containing a practical solution. It may reveal what feels unresolved without explaining how to resolve it. It may dramatize a concern rather than solve it. Sometimes that is still valuable. If a dream repeatedly places you in situations of exclusion, delay, exposure, or helplessness, it may not be telling you literal facts, but it may be reflecting recurring emotional concerns your waking mind has not fully named. Dreams can exaggerate, distort, and symbolize, but in doing so they may make certain themes more visible. This is one reason dreams so often feel emotionally meaningful even when they are narratively ridiculous. The dream may not make sense at the level of plot, but it can make strong sense at the level of feeling. You may wake from a dream with a clear impression of grief, urgency, longing, embarrassment, relief, or fear, even if the dream itself involved architecture that changed shape every 10 seconds, and several people behaving like they had been written by a distracted committee. Emotion gives dreams coherence where logic does not. That is significant because emotion is a large part of what the sleeping brain seems to be processing. Some researchers have suggested that dreaming, especially an REM sleep, may help with emotional integration. The idea is not that dreams erase distress, but that the brain may use sleep to revisit emotionally charged material under neurochemical conditions different from waking life. In REM sleep, certain stress-related chemical systems are altered, and this may create a setting in which memories and emotions can be reactivated without exactly the same physiological intensity as during the original experience. The phrase sometimes used informally is sleeping to remember and sleeping to forget, meaning the brain may preserve the informational content of an experience while gradually reducing some of the raw, emotional charge attached to it. The evidence here is still being refined, and human emotions are not tidy laboratory creatures, but the general idea fits a common experience. After sleep, the fact of what happened remains, yet the feeling around it can be more manageable. Dreams may be one subjective window onto this emotional work. A troubling event from the day may return in altered form, mixed with older material, transformed into images that are not literal but emotionally adjacent. This can seem bizarre, but perhaps that is exactly the point. Literal repetition would not allow much flexibility. Symbolic or blended representation might permit the brain to place the event into a broader emotional landscape. That does not guarantee comfort. Dreams can be upsetting. Nightmares are a real and serious example of dreams becoming part of emotional suffering rather than relief. But in ordinary circumstances, the oddness of dreams may reflect the brain's attempt to process emotion in a broad associative network rather than in a narrow replay of events. Memory also plays a major role. Dreams frequently include fragments of recent experience, sometimes called day residue. A face, phrase, object, place, or minor event from the day may appear in a dream, often mixed with older memories. This suggests that recent material is still active in the sleeping brain. But dreams do not usually reproduce the day faithfully. They recombine it. A room from today may contain a person from childhood and the emotional tone of a conflict from last week. That mixture can be frustrating if you want literal interpretation, but it makes sense if the brain is integrating new information with older memory networks. The dream becomes a kind of theatre in which memory fragments meet, merge, and mutate. This meeting of fragments may have practical consequences even when the dream itself is not useful in any straightforward way. If sleep helps bind recent experiences to older knowledge, then dreaming may reflect that process of integration. The narrative or image may be nonsense, but the associative work behind it can still matter. A dream involving an old friend and a current work issue may not mean the friend has hidden insight about your spreadsheet. It may mean the brain has linked the emotional or conceptual pattern of the current problem with older social memory. That broader linking can later support waking intuition, creativity, or clearer recognition. In this sense, dreams may function less like messages and more like byproducts of the brain's overnight workshop. Imagine walking past a studio at night and seeing strange scraps on the floor, odd sketches pinned to a wall, half-finished models, and combinations of material that would look ridiculous to anyone expecting a final product. Those scraps may not mean much by themselves, but they show work is happening. Dreams are often like that. They are not the finished sculpture, they are the visible clutter of a mind in process. One especially interesting idea is that dreams may support simulation. That is, the dreaming brain may create virtual scenarios that allow practice, exploration, or emotional rehearsal without real-world consequences. This is particularly evident in threatening or anxiety-laden dreams, which often involve pursuit, failure, lateness, loss of control, or social exposure. Some evolutionary theories of dreaming have suggested that dreams may help rehearse responses to danger or social challenge, though the evidence is mixed and no single theory explains all dream content. Still, the brain clearly uses dreams to simulate situations. From a cognitive perspective, Simulation itself is valuable. The waking mind also relies on simulation when planning, imagining outcomes, rehearsing conversations, or anticipating risks. Dreaming may be a more immersive, less controlled continuation of that ability. Even ordinary dreams often contain elements of prediction, rehearsal, or testing. You may dream of trying to get somewhere and being blocked, of speaking and not being heard, of searching for something misplaced, of attempting a task under strange constraints. These are not always literal rehearsals for tomorrow's events, but they are scenarios of challenge, navigation, problem, and response. The dreaming mind is not simply replaying memory, it is generating possibilities from stored materials. Again, most of these possibilities are absurd, but the capacity to generate them may still serve the larger practical purpose of cognitive flexibility. This brings us back to creativity and insight. When the brain is willing to connect distant ideas, shift identities, alter settings, collapse time, and combine emotional themes, it is operating in a space far less rigid than waking reasoning. That looseness may help explain why people sometimes wake from dreams with solutions, phrases, melodies, images, or conceptual shifts that matter. The dream itself may not present the answer plainly. Sometimes the useful part is a mood, a metaphor, a visual form, or a realization that the problem can be looked at differently. A scientist might not dream the final formula, but may wake with a better angle on the problem. A writer might not dream a whole paragraph ready for publication, but may wake with the right image or tone. A person struggling with a personal dilemma may wake not with a full decision, but with the clear sense of what they are actually afraid of. These are practical outcomes, even if the road to them passed through absurd dream territory. It is also worth noting that dreams can reveal the mind's priorities with embarrassing honesty. During the day, we often distract ourselves, intellectualize, postpone, or flatten what matters. Dreams are not always so polite. The unresolved issue you insist is minor may return wearing a ridiculous disguise but carrying unmistakable emotional force. The conversation you claimed did not bother you may appear in altered form 3 nights in a row. The feeling you cannot name while awake may become obvious in a dream, because dreams often think in emotion first and logic second. That can make them feel wiser than they are, but it can also make them revealing in ways waking thought avoids. At the same time, one must be careful. Because dreams are ambiguous, people are tempted either to overread them or dismiss them completely. Neither extreme is particularly helpful. Overreading turns every detail into a code that demands interpretation. Dismissing ignores the fact that dream content often reflects what the brain is currently working on. A better position is modest curiosity. Dreams are not authoritative messages from a hidden oracle, but they may contain useful information about ongoing memory integration, emotional concerns, and associative processes. They are worth noticing, not worshipping. The practical purpose of dreams, then, may not lie primarily in their literal stories. It may lie in the processes those stories reflect and sometimes facilitate. Dreams may help the brain weave recent experience into older memory, soften emotional intensity, simulate challenges, explore alternative combinations, and broaden the associative field from which waking thought can later draw. That is a substantial practical purpose, even if the dream itself seems absurd. The sleeping brain does not owe us narrative elegance. It is trying to do cognitive work, not write a reviewable screenplay. There is also a relationship between dreaming and identity that matters for problem solving. During waking life, the self tends to feel continuous, deliberate, and somewhat defended. In dreams, that self can become unstable. You may be yourself, but also not quite yourself. Other people may stand in for parts of your own concern. Time may collapse. Roles may change. This instability can be disorienting, but it also frees the mind from some of its daytime rigidity. If a problem is tied to your self-concept, as many personal problems are, dreams may help by loosening that concept temporarily. The mind can explore emotional or social possibilities, without keeping the same strict profile of who you are supposed to be. That does not instantly solve identity-related conflicts, but it may open space around them. One reason morning after dream thinking can be so interesting is that waking consciousness re-enters after this period of loosened structure. The waking mind then tries to make sense of what remains. Sometimes it recovers only fragments. Sometimes only the emotional residue survives. Sometimes one image lingers and seems important for reasons that are hard to articulate. That residue can occasionally guide useful reflection. A person may realize not that the dream meant something in a fixed symbolic sense, but that it pointed toward a concern, pattern, or unresolved tension that deserves attention. In other cases, the residue contributes indirectly to insight by having altered the associative landscape during the night. Nightmares deserve special mention because they show the same systems under more distressing conditions. Nightmares often involve threat, helplessness, pursuit, or overwhelming emotion. They can be especially common during stress, after trauma, or when emotional load is high. In such cases, dreaming may reflect not successful integration, but a system struggling with it. Yet even here, the underlying principle remains. Dreams are bound up with memory, emotion, and simulation. They are not empty. Their practical role can become painful, but it is still part of the mind's attempt to process what waking life has left unsettled. This is why recurrent nightmares can sometimes shift when a person's waking circumstances or emotional understanding shift. The brain's night stories respond to daytime reality, even if not politely. It is also interesting that dreams often seem to prioritize social material. Many dreams involve people, conversations, misunderstandings, reunions, conflicts, and shifting relationships. This makes sense when you remember that much of human cognition is social cognition. The brain spends huge amounts of waking life tracking others, interpreting motives, anticipating reactions, and negotiating belonging. Dreams may provide a space where this material is reworked. A person from years ago may appear not because the brain wants to provide a nostalgic program, but because that person is linked to some emotional or relational pattern relevant now. Dreams are economical in this way. They reuse old characters to stage current concerns. So what should one do with dreams, practically speaking? Probably less than dream culture sometimes suggests, and more than pure dismissal allows. It can be helpful to notice recurring themes, emotional tones, repeated scenarios, or unusual shifts in dream life during periods of stress or change. It can also be useful, especially for creative people, to jot down dream fragments that contain striking images, phrases, or moods. Not because every dream contains genius, but because dreams occasionally reveal combinations that waking life would never have generated. Beyond that, dreams are perhaps best understood as one part of the sleeping brain's broader work, rather than as isolated objects demanding constant interpretation. This broader work is what matters most. Dreams are one way we can witness, however imperfectly, that the sleeping mind is active, associative, emotional, and engaged in reprocessing experience. Their stories may be strange because the brain's nighttime priorities are not the same as its daytime priorities. It is not trying to obey logic, chronology, or etiquette. It is linking, simulating, revisiting, and reorganizing. Out of that process can come emotional adjustment, creative flexibility, occasional insight, and a deeper sense that problems have dimensions beyond the forms in which we consciously state them. That is why it makes sense to call dreams strange stories with a practical purpose. The practical purpose is not always in the storyline itself. It is in what the storyline reveals about a brain using sleep to work differently. Dreams show a mind freed from some of its normal constraints, capable of moving through memory and emotion in fluid ways that would be difficult while fully awake. Sometimes those movements produce nonsense. Sometimes they produce fear. Sometimes they produce beauty, discovery, or the odd but useful realization that the problem troubling you is really about something deeper and simpler than you had admitted. And once we see dreams that way, As one expression of a broader nighttime effort to reorganize and recalibrate, the next step becomes clearer. If dreams are part of how the sleeping brain works through experience, then the deeper, quieter stages of sleep may matter just as much, perhaps even more, because they help clear away the mental noise that otherwise keeps insight buried. There is a kind of quiet that only arrives when the night has fully settled in, when the last bits of the day have loosened their grip, and the mind has stopped trying to keep up with everything at once. In that quiet, something very different begins to happen. Not the vivid, shifting, story-filled world of dreams, but a deeper, steadier condition in which the brain moves into slow, powerful rhythms. This is deep sleep, often called slow-wave sleep, and it is one of the least dramatic-looking but most important states the brain enters. It does not feel like thinking. It does not look like problem-solving, and yet without it, clear thinking becomes harder, insight becomes rarer, and even simple tasks begin to feel strangely heavy. Deep sleep is not about adding new ideas. It is about making space for them. If dreaming is the mind experimenting with associations and emotional themes, deep sleep is closer to maintenance, calibration, and reduction. It is where the brain clears, stabilizes, and resets. The word repair is often used here, and while it can sound like something mechanical, it captures an important truth. The brain, after a full day of use, is not in the same condition as it was in the morning. It has been active, responsive, constantly adapting. Synapses have strengthened, signals have repeated, patterns have formed, and energy has been spent. Without a phase in which some of that activity is balanced and refined, the system would become inefficient, noisy, and increasingly difficult to manage. Deep sleep appears to be one of the main times when that balancing happens. To understand what is being repaired or cleared, it helps to think about how much activity accumulates during waking life. Every time you learn something, notice something, respond to something, or even ignore something, the brain is adjusting. Connections between neurons change strength. Some pathways become easier to activate, others become less used. This constant adjustment is essential for learning, but it also creates a kind of build-up. If everything that was strengthened during the day remained equally strong, the system would become saturated. Signals would compete with each other. The distinction between what matters and what does not would blur. The brain would become less selective, less efficient, and more prone to confusion. Deep sleep may help prevent that by supporting a process often described as downscaling or recalibration. Rather than preserving every increase in connection strength, the brain seems to reduce overall activity while preserving the relative importance of certain pathways. In simpler terms, the most meaningful connections remain stronger than the rest, but the entire system is brought back into a balanced range. It is like lowering the volume across a whole piece of music while keeping the melody clearer than the background. This helps ensure that the brain remains responsive without becoming overwhelmed. This reduction of excess activity has a direct effect on thinking. A brain that has not had the chance to recalibrate tends to feel cluttered. Thoughts repeat. Attention drifts. Small distractions become larger than they should be. Decisions feel heavier. The mind struggles to separate signal from noise. By contrast, after good deep sleep, thinking often feels cleaner. It is not that the world has become simpler. It is that the internal environment in which the world is being processed has become more organized. The background noise is lower. The relevant patterns stand out more clearly. There is also a physical dimension to this clearing process. The brain is an energy-intensive organ, and like any active system, it produces byproducts. During deep sleep, certain processes that help clear these metabolic byproducts appear to become more active. Fluid moves differently through the brain's tissue, helping to wash away substances that accumulate during waking activity. The details are still being studied, but the general idea is compelling. The brain uses sleep, especially its deeper stages, to maintain a healthier internal environment. This is not something you feel directly in the moment, but over time it influences how well the brain functions. This physical clearing connects to the mental clarity people often report after a good night's sleep. When the internal environment is better regulated, neural communication becomes more efficient. Signals travel more reliably. Networks interact more smoothly. This does not make a person instantly brilliant, but it does create conditions in which thinking can proceed without as much interference. It is easier to focus, easier to shift attention, easier to hold information in mind, and easier to recognize patterns. All of these are essential for problem solving. Deep sleep is also closely linked to certain forms of memory consolidation. While REM sleep is often associated with more flexible, associative processing, deep non-REM sleep appears especially important for stabilizing factual and procedural information. During this stage, the brain's slow oscillations help coordinate activity between regions, particularly between the hippocampus and the cortex. This coordination supports the transfer and integration of newly learned material into longer-term storage. The result is not only that memories last longer, but that they become more accessible and better organized. This organization is not just about storing information, it is about structuring it in a way that makes future thinking easier. A memory that is well integrated into existing knowledge is more useful than one that sits in isolation. Deep sleep helps with this integration by providing a stable, low-noise environment in which memory traces can be replayed and strengthened without the constant interruption of new input. During the day, learning is always competing with ongoing experience. At night, especially in deep sleep, the brain can revisit what it already has and refine it. This refinement contributes directly to the feeling that problems become clearer after sleep. Even if no dramatic insight occurs, the underlying information is better organized. Details that were previously hard to retrieve may come more easily. Relationships between pieces of information may feel more obvious. The brain has done some of the work of sorting and stabilizing, which reduces the effort required to use that information when you wake up. Another important feature of deep sleep is its effect on emotional balance. While REM sleep often gets more attention in discussions of emotional processing, deep sleep also plays a role in regulating how the brain responds to stress and stimulation. When deep sleep is reduced, people often become more reactive, less patient, and less able to manage emotional intensity. This can make problems feel larger and more urgent than they are, which in turn makes clear thinking more difficult. Deep sleep helps keep emotional responses within a manageable range, which is essential for evaluating situations realistically. Consider how much easier it is to think through a problem when you are calm compared to when you are overwhelmed. The information may be the same, but the way you interact with it changes completely. Deep sleep supports that calmer baseline. It does not remove emotion, but it helps prevent emotion from dominating cognition in ways that block reasoning. This is one of the reasons why people often advise against making important decisions late at night. It is not just about fatigue. It is about the brain being in a state where emotional and cognitive balance is not at its best. The timing of deep sleep also matters. It tends to be more prominent in the earlier part of the night. This means that going to bed very late or repeatedly cutting sleep short can disproportionately reduce the amount of deep sleep a person gets. Even if total sleep time seems adequate, the structure of that sleep may be altered in ways that reduce its effectiveness. This is one of the less obvious ways modern habits can interfere with cognitive function. It is not only how long you sleep, but how that sleep is distributed across its natural stages. When deep sleep is consistently disrupted, the effects accumulate. Learning becomes less efficient. Memory becomes less stable. Emotional regulation becomes more difficult. Attention becomes more fragile. Over time, this can create a sense that thinking itself has become harder, even if nothing obvious has changed in the external world. The brain is still working, but it is doing so without the full benefit of its nightly recalibration. On the other hand, when deep sleep is sufficient and consistent, the difference can be subtle but significant. The mind feels less crowded. Tasks that seem complicated may feel more manageable. The ability to focus improves. The transition between different kinds of thinking becomes smoother. These are not dramatic changes, but they create a foundation on which more complex cognitive work becomes possible. It is much easier to have insight when the system is not struggling under unnecessary noise. There is also a relationship between deep sleep and cognitive flexibility. Flexibility depends on the brain's ability to shift between different networks and perspectives. When the system is overloaded or poorly regulated, it tends to become rigid. It sticks to familiar patterns even when they are not effective. Deep sleep, by helping restore balance and reduce excess activity, supports the conditions in which flexibility can return. This makes it easier to reconsider assumptions, explore alternatives, and adapt to new information. In this sense, deep sleep is not directly generating solutions, but it is preparing the ground for them. It removes obstacles that would otherwise block clear thinking. It stabilizes useful information and reduces interference from irrelevant material. It helps regulate emotional responses so that problems can be evaluated more objectively. It supports the overall efficiency of neural communication. All of these factors increase the likelihood that when the brain does engage in more flexible associative processing, the results will be meaningful rather than chaotic. It is also worth noting that deep sleep is not something you can force directly. Like sleep in general, it depends on conditions rather than commands. Regular sleep schedules, exposure to natural light during the day, reduced stimulation before bed, and a comfortable sleep environment all support the likelihood of entering deep sleep. Stress, irregular timing, excessive light at night, and certain substances can interfere with it. The brain is quite capable of producing deep sleep when given the right conditions, but it does not respond well to being pushed or rushed. This brings us back to the broader idea of how the brain solves problems during sleep. Deep sleep plays a quieter role than dreams or sudden insights, but it may be just as important. Without the clearing, stabilizing, and recalibrating that happens in deep sleep, the more visible aspects of problem solving would have less to work with. It is difficult to build new understanding on a foundation that is cluttered or unstable. Deep sleep helps ensure that the foundation is solid. Think of it as preparing a workspace. Before you can assemble something complex, you need a surface that is clear enough to hold the pieces, tools that are in working order, and a sense of where things belong. Deep sleep does that for the brain. It clears the surface, organizes the tools, and resets the system so that the next phase of thinking can proceed more effectively. It does not decide what you will build, but it makes building possible. And once that clearing has taken place, once the noise has been reduced and the system has been brought back into balance, the brain is in a much better position to engage in the kind of flexible, creative processing that often happens during REM sleep, where ideas can be combined in unusual ways and new possibilities can begin to take shape. There is a point in the night when the brain begins to behave in a way that would look very familiar if you could observe it without context, and yet the person it belongs to is completely asleep. The body lies still, largely disconnected from movement, but the brain is active in a pattern that resembles wakefulness in some important ways. The eyes move rapidly beneath closed lids. The mind fills with imagery, scenes, voices, fragments of memory, emotion, and strange transformations. This is REM sleep, and it is one of the most unusual states the brain enters. It is not fully like waking, and not like deep sleep either. It is something in between, or perhaps something beside both, and within this state the brain becomes unusually flexible. Flexibility here does not mean clarity in the ordinary sense. REM sleep is not a tidy place. It is not careful, precise, or particularly concerned with correctness. It is fluid, associative, and often indifferent to logic. Yet this looseness is precisely what makes it interesting for creativity and problem solving. During waking life, the brain balances two competing needs. It must be focused enough to complete tasks and follow rules, but flexible enough to adapt and generate new ideas. Too much focus creates rigidity. too much flexibility creates chaos. REM sleep shifts that balance strongly toward flexibility, and in doing so, it creates conditions that can reveal possibilities hidden during the day. One of the key features of REM sleep is the pattern of brain activity that supports internally generated experience. Regions involved in visual imagery, emotional processing, and memory become highly active. At the same time, certain parts of the prefrontal cortex that support strict reasoning, inhibition, and self-monitoring are less active than they are during waking thought. This combination produces a mind that is vivid, emotionally engaged, and free from some of the constraints that normally shape thinking. It is a mind that can move quickly between ideas, merge distant memories, and create new combinations without immediately rejecting them. This matters because many problems are not solved by applying rules more forcefully. They are solved by seeing connections that rules alone would not reveal. During the day, attention is guided by goals. You're trying to finish something, fix something, or understand something in a specific way. That goal-directed focus is efficient, but it narrows the field. It prioritizes certain information and suppresses other information. REM sleep reduces that suppression. It allows weaker, more distant associations to come forward. Ideas that would normally be filtered out as irrelevant or strange are given space to appear. This is why REM dreams often feel so unusual. A place becomes another place without warning. A person changes identity mid-conversation. Time collapses. Objects behave in ways that would never pass inspection in daylight. These are not errors in the system. They are signs that the usual boundaries between concepts have loosened. The brain is not trying to maintain a consistent external reality. It is exploring internal relationships. That exploration can be messy, but it can also be productive in a different sense. It increases the chance that the brain will encounter a connection it would otherwise miss. Think about how creativity often works. It is rarely about producing something completely new from nothing. It is about combining existing elements in a way that feels new. A melody emerges from familiar notes arranged differently. A solution appears when two separate ideas are linked. A metaphor connects one domain to another. REM sleep is well suited to this kind of combination because it allows the brain to move across memory networks more freely. The usual categories that keep ideas separate become more permeable. This does not guarantee a useful outcome, but it increases the range of possibilities the brain considers. There is also a strong emotional component to REM sleep. The brain does not process ideas in isolation from feeling. During REM, emotional centers are highly active, which means that the associations formed are often colored by emotional relevance. This can be helpful because many important problems are not purely logical. They involve meaning, value, and personal significance. A solution that makes sense intellectually but feels wrong emotionally is often not sustainable. REM sleep allows the brain to explore ideas in a way that includes emotion rather than suppressing it. This can lead to insights that feel not only correct, but also fitting. At the same time, the reduced activity in certain control regions means that the brain is less likely to reject ideas too quickly. During waking life, many potentially useful ideas are discarded early because they do not fit existing expectations or because they seem too unconventional. This filtering is necessary for efficiency, but it can also block creativity. In REM sleep, that filter is weaker. Ideas are allowed to develop further before being evaluated. This can lead to combinations that would never survive the first moment of conscious scrutiny. This is why people sometimes wake from a dream with a sense that something important has been glimpsed, even if it is not fully clear. The dream itself may not present a complete solution, but it may have brought together elements in a new way. The waking mind can then take that partial connection and refine it. In this sense, REM sleep does not replace conscious problem solving. It complements it. The night generates possibilities. The day evaluates and applies them. There are many examples of this kind of process in creative work. A person struggling with a design problem may wake with a new arrangement in mind. A writer may find a better way to structure a story. A scientist may notice a pattern that was not obvious before. These outcomes are not guaranteed, and they are not always dramatic, but they illustrate how the brain's flexibility during REM can contribute to insight. The important point is not that dreams contain answers, but that the conditions of REM sleep make certain kinds of thinking more likely. Another interesting aspect of REM sleep is its role in integrating different types of memory. During waking life, information is often stored in different systems depending on its nature. Factual knowledge, procedural skills, emotional experiences and sensory details may be processed in somewhat distinct ways. REM sleep appears to support the interaction between these systems. It allows the brain to link information across categories, which is essential for building complex understanding. A practical problem may be informed by an emotional memory. A technical idea may be influenced by a visual image. These cross-connections are often where creativity emerges. This integration also helps explain why REM sleep can feel so rich and layered. Dreams often contain elements from different times, places and contexts woven together. While the result may seem chaotic, it reflects a brain that is actively combining material from across its stores. That combination can produce new perspectives. A current problem may be reframed through the lens of an older experience. A familiar situation may be seen in an unfamiliar way. These shifts do not always translate directly into waking insight, but they expand the range of possible interpretations. There is also a temporal pattern to REM sleep that matters. REM periods tend to become longer and more frequent in the later part of the night. This means that the final hours of sleep are especially rich in the kind of flexible, associative processing associated with REM. Cutting sleep short can reduce this phase disproportionately. Even if a person gets some sleep, missing the later REM-heavy cycles may limit the brain's opportunity to engage in this kind of creative recombination. This is one reason why waking up too early or sleeping irregularly can affect not just how rested you feel, but how flexible your thinking becomes. The relationship between REM sleep and creativity is not absolute. Not every dream leads to a useful idea. In fact, most do not. The brain in REM is generating many combinations, and only a small fraction of those combinations will be meaningful in a practical sense. But the process itself is valuable, because it increases the probability that useful combinations will occur. Creativity often depends on generating many possibilities, and then selecting the ones that work. REM sleep contributes to the generation phase. It expands the pool from which the waking mind can choose. It is also important to recognize that REM sleep works in concert with other stages of sleep. Deep sleep helps clear noise and stabilize memory. REM sleep builds on that by exploring connections and generating new combinations. The two processes are not separate systems but parts of a cycle. The brain alternates between consolidation and exploration, between reducing noise and increasing flexibility. This balance is what allows both reliable memory and creative insight to coexist. From a practical perspective, this suggests that good sleep supports not just energy and mood, but the ability to think in different ways. When sleep is fragmented or insufficient, the balance between stability and flexibility is disrupted. The brain may struggle to hold information clearly or to explore alternatives effectively. This can make problems feel both more confusing and harder to solve. By contrast, a well-rested brain is better able to move between focused and flexible modes of thinking. It can hold a problem steady and also see it from new angles. There is something quietly reassuring about this. It means that creativity is not only a matter of talent or effort, it is also a matter of conditions. The brain has built-in processes that support flexible thinking, and sleep is one of the main ways those processes are activated. You do not have to force creativity in every moment of the day. Sometimes the most effective thing you can do is step back, allow the brain to enter its different states and let those states contribute in their own way. This does not mean that sleep will solve every problem or produce every idea. It is not a substitute for learning, practice, or deliberate thought. But it is a powerful partner. It allows the brain to operate in modes that waking life does not permit. It expands the range of connections, adjusts the balance of control and association, and creates opportunities for insight to emerge. And once those opportunities begin to appear, once the brain has had the chance to explore possibilities more freely, another pattern becomes easier to understand. Sometimes the most effective way to solve a problem is not to push harder at all, but to step away and allow the mind to work without direct interference, letting the next step emerge when the system is ready rather than forcing it before it has formed. There is a quiet contradiction in the way people try to solve problems. The more something matters, the more tightly we tend to hold on to it. We stare at it longer, push harder, repeat the same line of thought with increasing determination, as if effort alone could force clarity to appear. And sometimes that works. Some problems do yield to persistence, especially when they require careful step-by-step reasoning or sustained attention. But there is another category of problems, and they are very common, where pushing harder does not help. In fact, it often makes things worse. The mind becomes narrower, more rigid, more certain in the wrong direction. It circles the same ideas, revisits the same assumptions, and becomes increasingly convinced that the answer must lie just one more step along the same path. It is in these situations that stepping away, especially stepping into sleep, can become one of the most effective things you can do. Letting go is often misunderstood. It sounds passive, even irresponsible, as if you are abandoning the problem or refusing to engage with it. But in cognitive terms, letting go is not the absence of work. It is a change in how work is done. When you step away from a problem, you're not erasing it from the brain. The information remains, the question remains, the attempts you have already made remain. What changes is the mode of processing. Instead of directing attention tightly toward one interpretation, you allow the mind to move more freely. Instead of forcing a solution in real time, you create space for the brain's background processes to operate. Sleep is the most complete form of this shift, but the principle begins even before you close your eyes. During waking life, attention is a powerful but limited resource. It can focus deeply, but only on a narrow set of information at any given moment. When you are actively working on a problem, attention selects certain features and suppresses others. This is necessary for efficiency, but it also creates blind spots. You may be ignoring exactly the piece of information that would make the problem solvable. The more you focus in the same way, the more those blind spots become fixed. Stepping away allows attention to disengage from its current pattern. When you return later, especially after sleep, the selection process can start fresh. Different features may stand out, different associations may become available. There is also the issue of cognitive fixation. When you approach a problem in a particular way, you tend to reuse that approach, even if it is not working. This is partly because the brain prefers familiar routes. Once a pathway has been activated repeatedly, it becomes easier to activate again. This can create a loop in which the same ineffective strategy is applied over and over. Stepping away interrupts that loop. It reduces the dominance of the current pathway and allows other possibilities to emerge. Sleep enhances this effect because it changes the balance of neural activity more profoundly than a simple break. Emotion plays a role here as well. When a problem is important, it often carries emotional weight. You may feel urgency, frustration, anxiety, or pressure to find an answer quickly. These feelings can narrow thinking. They push the brain toward immediate resolution rather than exploration. They make certain options feel unacceptable before they are even fully considered. Letting go, especially through sleep, can reduce this emotional intensity. The problem is still there, but it is no longer surrounded by the same level of urgency. This creates room for more balanced evaluation and more flexible thinking. One of the most interesting aspects of stepping away is that it allows unconscious processing to continue. The brain does not simply stop working on a problem when you stop thinking about it consciously. The information remains active in various ways. Memory traces are still being processed, associations are still forming, patterns are still being evaluated. During sleep, these processes become more prominent because the brain is not occupied with external tasks. The result is that the problem continues to evolve even when you are not actively engaging with it. This ongoing processing is often called incubation. It refers to the period in which a problem is set aside but not forgotten. During incubation, the brain may reorganize information, weaken unhelpful associations, and strengthen useful ones. It may also explore alternative representations of the problem. When you return to the problem after incubation, you may find that it looks different. The solution may be clearer, or at least the next step may be more obvious. Sleep is a particularly powerful form of incubation because it combines several beneficial factors. It reduces external input, allowing the brain to focus on internal processing. It changes the chemical environment of the brain, which affects how information is handled. It cycles through different stages, each supporting different aspects of memory and cognition. It also provides enough time for these processes to unfold fully. The result is that sleep can transform a problem in ways that shorter breaks cannot. It is important to note that letting go does not mean ignoring the problem completely. Effective incubation usually follows a period of engagement. You need to understand the problem well enough to provide the brain with useful material. If you step away too early, before you have explored the problem at all, there may be little for the brain to work with. The most effective pattern often involves a cycle. Engage with the problem, step away, allow incubation, and then return with a fresh perspective. Sleep naturally fits into this cycle as the deepest form of stepping away. There is also a practical advantage in the way stepping away affects perspective. When you are immersed in a problem, it can feel larger and more complex than it actually is. Every detail seems significant. Every obstacle feels critical. This can make it difficult to see the overall structure of the issue. Distance helps restore proportion. After a break or a night's sleep, the problem often appears smaller or more manageable. This does not mean it has changed, but your relationship to it has. You're no longer as entangled in its details, which makes it easier to identify what truly matters. This shift in perspective is closely related to cognitive flexibility. Flexibility is the ability to move between different ways of thinking, to consider multiple possibilities, and to adapt to new information. It is essential for solving complex problems, especially those that do not have a single obvious solution. Stepping away supports flexibility by reducing the dominance of the current approach. It allows the brain to reset and explore alternative strategies. Sleep enhances this by providing a full cycle of cognitive reorganization. There is also a timing element to consider. Many people notice that their best ideas or clearest thinking occur after a period of rest rather than during prolonged effort. This is not a coincidence. The brain's ability to generate and evaluate ideas depends on its overall state. When it is fatigued, overloaded, or emotionally strained, its capacity for flexible thinking is reduced. Rest, including sleep, restores that capacity. It allows the brain to operate more efficiently and creatively. This does not mean that effort is unnecessary. On the contrary, effort is essential for providing the raw material for insight, but effort alone is not sufficient. Without periods of rest and incubation, effort can become counterproductive. The key is to balance engagement with disengagement, focus with flexibility, persistence with letting go. This balance allows the brain to use all of its available modes of processing rather than relying on a single approach. There is something deeply practical about this. It suggests that solving problems is not only about how hard you work, but also about how you manage your attention and energy. It suggests that stepping away is not a failure of effort, but a strategic part of thinking. It suggests that sleep is not a break from problem solving, but a continuation of it in a different form. It also suggests a certain patience. Not every problem can be solved immediately. Some require time for the brain to reorganize information and discover new patterns. Trying to force a solution before the brain is ready can lead to frustration and poor decisions. Allowing time, including time for sleep, increases the likelihood that a better solution will emerge. There is a quiet confidence in this approach. It trusts that the brain, given the right conditions, will continue working on the problem even when you're not actively directing it. It recognizes that thinking is not a single process, but a combination of processes that operate across different states. It accepts that stepping back can be as important as pushing forward. And perhaps most importantly, it makes the process of solving problems less exhausting. Instead of treating every difficulty as something that must be resolved through continuous effort, it allows for rhythm. Work, rest, return, engage, release, reconsider. This rhythm aligns with how the brain naturally functions. It uses both the focused power of waking thought and the quieter, more flexible processes that unfold during sleep. So when you find yourself stuck, when the problem feels resistant to every attempt, it may be worth considering that the next step is not another push in the same direction. It may be a step back, a pause, a shift in attention, and eventually a night of sleep in which the mind continues its work without the pressure of immediate resolution, preparing the ground for a clearer answer to take shape when you return. There is a particular kind of mental fog that does not come from confusion about a topic, but from the state of the mind itself. You can know what you are supposed to do, understand the steps, even remember the relevant information, and yet everything feels slightly out of reach. Thoughts do not hold together. Attention slips. Small decisions feel heavier than they should. You reread the same line and somehow absorb less each time. It is not that the world has become more complicated overnight. It is that the brain you're using to meet the world is not operating at its usual level. Very often, this kind of fog traces back to one simple but deeply influential factor: sleep that was shortened, fragmented, or poor in quality. It is easy to underestimate how much sleep contributes to clear thinking, because the effects of poor sleep are not always dramatic in a single night. A person can function, speak, respond, and even complete tasks while tired. Humans are remarkably capable of continuing under less than ideal conditions, but beneath that surface capability, something important has shifted. The brain has not completed the full range of processes it relies on to stay organized, flexible, and efficient. The result is not a total breakdown, but a subtle degradation across many systems at once. And when those small reductions accumulate, thinking becomes slower, narrower, and more error-prone. One of the first things to suffer when sleep is disrupted is attention. Attention is the gateway through which all information enters conscious thought. If attention is unstable, everything that depends on it becomes unstable as well. After poor sleep, it becomes harder to sustain focus on a task. The mind drifts more easily. External distractions feel stronger. Internal distractions, such as thoughts or worries, become more intrusive. This is not simply a matter of willpower. It reflects changes in how the brain regulates attention at a neural level. Networks that support sustained focus are less coordinated, and the ability to filter out irrelevant information is reduced. This has immediate consequences for problem solving. If you cannot hold the relevant pieces of a problem in mind, it becomes difficult to see how they fit together. You may miss important details or fail to notice relationships that would otherwise be obvious. Even simple tasks can feel more complicated because attention keeps slipping away from them. The problem itself has not changed, but your ability to engage with it has. Working memory is also affected. This is the system that allows you to hold and manipulate information over short periods of time. It is essential for reasoning, planning, and decision-making. When sleep is poor, working memory becomes less reliable. You may lose track of what you were thinking halfway through a sentence. You may forget the first part of a problem while trying to solve the second part. You may find it harder to compare options or follow multi-step processes. This makes complex thinking much more difficult because the brain cannot maintain a stable representation of the problem. At the same time, cognitive flexibility decreases. Flexibility is what allows you to shift between different perspectives, consider alternative solutions, and adapt when a strategy is not working. When you are well rested, the brain can move between different modes of thinking more easily. It can try one approach, recognize when it is not effective, and switch to another. When sleep is disrupted, this ability weakens. The brain becomes more rigid. It tends to repeat the same approach even when it is clearly not working. This is one reason why problems that require insight or reframing become especially difficult under sleep deprivation. The mind is less able to step outside its current pattern. Emotion is another major factor. Sleep plays a crucial role in regulating emotional responses. When sleep is insufficient or fragmented, emotional reactions tend to become stronger and less controlled. Small frustrations feel larger, minor setbacks feel more significant, uncertainty feels more threatening. This emotional amplification can distort thinking. It makes certain interpretations seem more convincing than they are, and makes it harder to evaluate situations calmly. For example, a problem that might normally be approached with curiosity can feel overwhelming when you are tired. Instead of exploring possible solutions, you may focus on the difficulty itself. Instead of considering alternatives, you may fixate on the risk of failure. This is not because the problem has changed, but because the emotional context in which you're thinking about it has shifted. Sleep helps maintain that context in a balanced state. Without it, the balance tilts. Memory is also affected in two important ways. First, new information is less effectively encoded when you are sleep deprived. This means that learning becomes more difficult. You may read something and feel as though you understand it, only to find later that very little was retained. Second, the consolidation of memory. The process by which new information is stabilized and integrated is disrupted. This means that even what you do manage to learn is less likely to become part of your long-term knowledge. Over time, this creates a compounding effect. Each day's learning is less effectively stored, which reduces the material available for future thinking. This has a direct impact on problem solving. Many solutions depend on combining new information with existing knowledge. If memory is weak or poorly organized, those combinations become harder to form. The brain has fewer stable pieces to work with and less ability to connect them effectively. This makes both learning and creativity more difficult. There is also an effect on decision-making. When the brain is tired, it tends to favor simpler, more immediate choices. It becomes less sensitive to long-term consequences and more influenced by short-term considerations. This can lead to decisions that feel easier in the moment, but are less optimal overall. The ability to weigh options carefully, consider multiple outcomes, and choose based on broader goals is reduced. This is not because the person has changed their values, but because the cognitive systems that support complex evaluation are not functioning at full capacity. Another subtle but important effect is on error detection. When you're well rested, the brain is better at noticing when something is wrong. It can catch inconsistencies, recognize mistakes, and adjust accordingly. When sleep is poor, this monitoring function weakens. Errors are more likely to go unnoticed, and incorrect assumptions are less likely to be questioned. This can make problem solving particularly frustrating, because you may continue working within a flawed framework without realizing it. The cumulative effect of all these changes is a kind of mental narrowing. The brain becomes less able to hold multiple possibilities, less able to shift perspective, less able to regulate emotion, and less able to maintain attention. This creates a situation in which problems feel harder, not necessarily because they are harder, but because the mind is less equipped to handle them. It is also worth noting that disrupted sleep is not only about total sleep time. The structure and continuity of sleep matter as well. Frequent awakenings, irregular sleep schedules, or conditions that interfere with normal sleep stages can reduce the effectiveness of sleep, even if the total duration seems adequate. The brain relies on cycling through different stages, including deep sleep and REM sleep, to complete its various processes. When these cycles are interrupted, the work remains incomplete. This incomplete processing has a ripple effect. The brain starts the next day without having fully cleared, organized, and recalibrated. Attention is weaker, memory is less stable, emotional regulation is reduced, and flexibility is limited. The person may still function, but the quality of that function is lower. Over time, if poor sleep continues, these effects can accumulate, leading to persistent difficulties in thinking, learning, and decision-making. There is also a feedback loop to consider. Poor sleep makes problems harder to solve, and unsolved problems can make it harder to sleep. Worry, stress, and frustration can interfere with the ability to fall asleep or stay asleep. This creates a cycle in which sleep and thinking both suffer. Breaking this cycle often requires addressing both sides, improving sleep conditions, and reducing the intensity of the problems being carried into the night. One of the most practical implications of all this is that sleep should not be treated as optional when clear thinking is required. It is not simply a matter of feeling rested, it is a matter of cognitive function. The brain needs sleep to perform the processes that support attention, memory, flexibility, and emotional balance. Without those processes, even the best strategies and the most determined effort can fall short. This does not mean that every problem requires perfect sleep to be solved. People can and do think under less than ideal conditions. But the difference between thinking while well rested and thinking while sleep deprived is significant. It is the difference between working with a clear, organized system and working with one that is cluttered and unstable. There is also a certain kindness in recognizing this. When thinking feels difficult, it is easy to blame yourself, to assume that you're not trying hard enough or not capable enough. But often, the issue is not a lack of ability. It is a lack of the conditions that allow that ability to function. Sleep is one of those conditions. It is not a luxury or a reward. It is part of the foundation on which clear thinking is built. And once that foundation is restored, once the brain has had the chance to complete its nightly work and return to a more balanced state, the difference can be noticeable. Problems that felt tangled may begin to loosen. Thoughts that felt scattered may become more coherent. Decisions that felt overwhelming may become more manageable. The mind does not become perfect, but it becomes more capable. This brings us back to the broader pattern of how the brain works across waking and sleep. During the day, you gather information, attempt solutions, and engage with the world. During the night, the brain organizes, integrates, and recalibrates. When this cycle is disrupted, the system struggles. When it is maintained, the system supports itself. And in that support, in the steady rhythm of effort and rest, the mind finds its ability to think clearly, to adapt, and to discover solutions that might otherwise remain just out of reach. By the time we arrive here, at the soft edge of the night and the end of this long, gentle exploration, there is something rather comforting in admitting that the mind is not limited to the hours when we are consciously steering it. All day long, we tend to think of ourselves as the managers of our thoughts. We focus, decide, compare, worry, revise and try, often with a seriousness that would be quite admirable if it were not occasionally so exhausting. We assume that progress happens only when we are visibly engaged in it. We imagine that the mind works best when we are pushing it, directing it, keeping it on task like a strict schoolmaster with a clipboard and very little patience. And yet, night after night, the brain quietly shows us something else. It shows us that some of its most useful work happens when the conscious self steps back. Not because effort is unimportant, but because effort is only one part of thinking. The rest belongs to rhythm, timing, and trust. That word, trust, can sound a little too soft for science at first. It may seem vague compared to neurons, memory traces, oscillations, and neurotransmitters, but trust is, in its own way, one of the most practical parts of the story. To sleep at all is to trust a process you cannot directly manage. You can prepare for it. You can support it. You can make it more likely by giving it the right conditions. But you cannot command it in the way you command a hand to lift a cup or eyes to look toward a window. Sleep begins when the brain shifts states, and once it does, a different kind of work takes over. If you fight that shift too hard, if you demand conscious control over every stage of it, you often make it harder. The mind works differently at night, and one of the deepest forms of intelligence may simply be allowing that difference to happen. There is a certain relief in this, especially in a world that prizes relentless effort. So much of modern life encourages the idea that every problem must be met with more attention, more pressure, more late-night persistence, more one last thing before bed. We celebrate the image of the person who keeps going, who pushes through fatigue, who answers every question by staying up a little longer. And sometimes, of course, determination matters. But there is a point beyond which more effort stops being productive and starts becoming noise. The mind grows crowded. The same thought loops repeat. Emotional urgency begins to masquerade as clarity. The problem swells to fill the whole room. At that point, to sleep is not to abandon the work. It is to stop interfering with another form of it. That may be one of the gentlest corrections science offers to the anxious mind. You do not have to solve everything before sleep in order for sleep to help you. In fact, many things become more solvable because you did not keep forcing them. The brain does not need perfect closure at bedtime to continue processing experience. It only needs enough material, enough relevant traces, enough half-formed connections to carry into the night. Then the rhythms of sleep begin. Deep sleep helps clear noise and stabilize what matters. Other stages loosen associations, integrate memories, and rebalance emotion. Dreams may sketch strange versions of concerns the waking mind could not quite name. By morning, the problem may not be gone, but it may no longer be standing in exactly the same place. This is one of the quiet gifts of sleep. It does not always produce answers, but it often changes the terms of the question. It can reduce the size of a fear without denying that the fear exists. It can clarify which detail matters and which only felt loud because you were tired. It can turn a pile of thoughts into a pattern into an intuition into the beginning of a decision. And sometimes, in those especially lovely moments, it can make the answer feel so natural that you wonder why it was hidden at all. Not because you were foolish before, but because the brain had not yet done the night's work that allows certain things to become visible. There is also something very human in the fact that we need this hidden work. We do not live by conscious reason alone. We are creatures of memory, association, emotion, habit, rhythm, and body. Our thinking is shaped by chemistry, timing, sleep stages, daylight, fatigue, and the simple fact that the brain is not one thing performing one task all the time. It is a living system that alternates modes, each with strengths and limits. Wakefulness gives us focus, analysis, and direct engagement with the world. Sleep gives us organization, restoration, emotional recalibration, and the chance for hidden connections to emerge. Neither mode is complete by itself. Together they make thought possible in the richer sense. That is why poor sleep feels so different from mere inconvenience. It is not simply that you are tired and therefore less cheerful. It is that the whole partnership between waking effort and sleeping integration has been interrupted. The day has gathered more than the night could sort. The mind begins again without full recalibration. Attention weakens, flexibility narrows, emotion sharpens, memory becomes patchier. The result is often a strange kind of self-doubt. People think they have become less capable, less disciplined, less intelligent. But often what has really happened is that the system has been denied one of the states it depends on to function well. This is not a moral failure. It is biology asking to be respected. And respect for sleep does not have to be grand or sentimental. It can be practical. It can be as simple as recognizing that rest is not an interruption to thinking, but part of its architecture. The mind does not only work when you're watching it. In fact, some of its finest adjustments happen when you are not. The sentence you could not finish may settle into place by morning. The decision that felt impossible may reveal its true shape after a night of reduced emotional noise. The concept that would not quite make sense may become smoother once memory has been reorganized. Even if none of these happen spectacularly, the brain is still using sleep to prepare you for the next attempt. It is still clearing, sorting, balancing, and setting the stage for better cognition tomorrow. Perhaps that is why so many old pieces of advice about sleep have survived, even before the science caught up in detail. Sleep on it. Morning is wiser. Things look different in daylight. These sayings are not perfect, but they point towards something true. Human beings noticed long ago that the mind returning from sleep is not the same mind that went into it. They may not have spoken of hippocampal replay, synaptic recalibration, or REM-associated associative flexibility, but they knew, in experience, that night does something to thought. They knew that some forms of understanding cannot be wrung out of the mind by force. They ripen in darkness, in stillness, in the strange cooperation between unconscious processing and waking return. There is also comfort in the sheer regularity of this. You do not have to earn the brain's night work by being brilliant. You do not have to become a genius before bed so that sleep will take you seriously. This is one of the great equalizers of biology. The brain does its nocturnal labor for everyone, for the overworked, for the uncertain, for the student with notes still open on the desk, for the artist who thinks the piece is failing, for the parent who cannot stop replaying the day, for the person quietly carrying a decision they are not ready to name. The sleeping brain does not require a polished argument. It begins with fragments. It begins with traces. It begins wherever you actually are. Of course, it is also true that not every problem yields overnight. Some difficulties are real in ways that no sleep can solve directly. Grief does not disappear because the brain had several good cycles of REM. A broken system does not mend because you dreamt symbolically about trains. Missing information does not materialize by magic. Sleep is not a substitute for action, conversation, learning, or change. But even when it cannot solve the external problem, it can often improve the internal conditions from which you face it. It can help you meet the thing with more steadiness, more clarity, less distortion, less panic, and more capacity to think in ways that suffering and fatigue tend to block. That may not sound dramatic, but it is deeply valuable. So much of life depends not on perfect solutions, but on better states of mind from which to attempt them. Sleep helps create those states. It reminds the nervous system that not every signal deserves full alarm. It helps memory separate what matters from what merely shouted. It gives emotional life a chance to loosen from immediate intensity. It allows the waking self to return with a little more room around its thoughts. Sometimes room is all a problem needs before it stops feeling impossible. There is a beautiful modesty to this view of the mind. It does not portray us as masters of consciousness who must dominate every moment of our own cognition. It portrays us as participants in a living process larger than our immediate will. We gather the day, yes. We try, learn, struggle, notice, and care. But then we hand that gathered life to sleep, and sleep continues the work in its own language. Slow waves, spindles, REM bursts, replayed traces, emotional recombinations, quiet clearings. We do not supervise this, we receive its effects. Morning thought is partly a gift from a version of the brain that laboured while we were gone. That idea can soften something in us, I think. It can soften the fear that every unanswered question must be answered now. It can soften the tendency to treat uncertainty as failure. It can soften the belief that if clarity has not arrived by midnight, it is proof that clarity will never arrive. The mind needs intervals, it needs darkness. It needs states in which it is not performing for the world. And if you have ever woken with a calmer heart than the one you had the night before, or with a sentence that came more easily, or with the simple but precious feeling that something inside you had reorganized itself just enough to keep going, then you have already felt this truth. There is also something worth saying about rest beyond utility. Sleep helps thinking, yes. It helps memory, insight, creativity, and emotional balance. But it is not only valuable because it makes you more efficient tomorrow. Human beings deserve rest for reasons larger than performance. The brain is not a servant whose only purpose is to produce. It is the organ through which you experience being alive. To let it sleep is not merely to sharpen it for future use. It is to honour the rhythms by which it remains itself. This matters because many people only permit themselves rest if rest can be justified as productivity by another name. Sleep is indeed biologically productive, but even if it were less so, it would still be worthy. A mind need not defend every hour of stillness, and yet it is rather lovely that stillness does so much. Beneath the closed eyes and quiet body, the brain continues. It turns the day over. It protects some traces and lets others fade. It cleans, calibrates, simulates, reorganizes, and occasionally surprises. It links one memory to another, one worry to an older pattern, one unfinished question to a better frame. It moves through the hidden workshop of the night, not always elegantly, not always understandably, but often helpfully. Then morning comes, and with it, the return of the waking self, ready to inherit whatever the night has managed to shape. Maybe that is the thought to carry gently into sleep tonight. Not that the mind will solve everything by dawn, and not that every dream is a riddle waiting to be decoded, but simply that rest is not empty. If something remains unresolved, it is allowed to remain unresolved for a while. If a problem still sits beside you in the dark, it does not need to be wrestled every minute to be worked on. The brain knows some things about timing that the anxious self forgets. It knows how to continue without hurry. It knows how to sort in silence. It knows how to become less rigid, less noisy, less crowded, and sometimes, by doing so, a little wiser. So if you are listening now with a thought still lingering from the day, some small knot of uncertainty, some task unfinished, some question without a clean answer, perhaps you need not hold it so tightly. You have already done what the waking mind can do for now. You have noticed it. You have carried it. You have brought it this far. The rest may belong to the slower intelligence of sleep, to the mind beneath the mind, to the patient work that continues when effort gives way and the room grows still. And there is something peaceful in knowing that while you rest, you are not entirely paused. Somewhere behind the quiet of your face and the steadying of your breath, the brain will keep moving through its old ancient rhythm, keeping what matters, clearing what does not, and making, in its own hidden way, a little more sense of the life you live today. Sleep well, and let the night take its turn.